The North is cold and full of whispers.
Before we dive in, check the link in the description if you want exclusive timelines, members-only videos you won't find on YouTube, all on our Patreon. The torch burned low. Ned hadn't come down here looking for anything. That was the truth of it, the part he would never tell anyone. He had come down here to stand in the cold and breathe, to put stone walls between himself and a castle full of southern voices and Lannister silk and the sound of Robert laughing too loud at his own stories. He had come to see his father. He had come to see Lyanna. He did that sometimes when the weight got heavy enough. Stood before the statues and said nothing, and let the cold do what cold does, numb the parts that had been hurting so long they'd stopped having names. He held the torch up to her face. The stone carver had been skilled, too skilled, some days. The jaw was right, the eyes were right, even in gray stone, that particular quality Lyanna had of looking at you like she already knew what you were going to say and had decided it wasn't good enough. He'd loved her for it. He'd mourned her for it. He'd carried her last breath in his chest for 14 years and learned to walk upright with the weight of it. "Promise me, Ned." He turned to go. The torchlight moved with him and caught something. He stopped, behind the statue's base, behind the carved wolves at Lyanna's feet, a shadow that was the wrong shape. He had stood in this crypt 100 times, 200. He knew every seam of every stone. This shadow belonged to a gap that had no business being there. He crouched, held the torch closer, a stone, set slightly proud of the others, not loose from age, loose from intention. Someone had worked the mortar away in a pattern that left the block looking flush from any angle except this one, at this height, in this specific light. Lyanna had done this. He knew it before his fingers found the edge, knew it the way you know things that live below thought, in the body, in the blood. She was the only one who came down here alone in those last years before the war. Before Rhaegar, she used to tell their father she was leaving flowers at their mother's statue. She was never leaving flowers. The block moved. Behind it, a wooden box the size of a man's forearm, sealed with dark wax pressed by a small seal, not a house sigil, a personal one, a crescent moon with a single star at its center. He had never seen it before. He had never needed to. He sat on the cold floor with his back against his sister's statue and broke the seal. Inside, a book, small, the leather binding cracked with age. Beside it, 3 letters folded and sealed, the seals long since broken, opened and refolded, the handwriting on the outside in Lyanna's hand. And beneath the letters, wrapped in cloth so old it crumbled at his touch, a ring, silver. A 3-headed dragon chased around the band in the old Valyrian style, each head distinct, each jaw open. He held the ring for a long time without opening the book. The ring's origin he could only guess at. A Targaryen device, old silver gone dark at the edges. Whether Rhaegar had given it to her or whether she had taken it as the only physical proof she had of what they were to each other, he didn't know. He would never know. It was hers, and she had hidden it here, and that was enough. He opened the book. It was not a diary. That was the first thing he understood. Not a private devotional journal, not a personal record of feelings and days. It was a copy, a careful, deliberate copy made in a precise ecclesiastical hand of an entry from the faith's formal registry of sacraments. Whoever had copied it had understood that the original, filed in the Citadel's archives in Old Town, was too far away and too exposed to serve as anything a dying woman could hide behind a stone. So she had arranged for a copy to be made. Ned did not know when, did not know how. Lyanna had always been more resourceful than anyone gave her credit for, which was part of what had gotten her into the tower, and part of what had gotten her son out of it. The hand was precise and small, the script of a man trained to compress meaning into limited space. The date was written in full at the top, not abbreviated, not in Citadel shorthand, but formally as one writes the date when one understands that what follows will matter to people not yet born. The location, a sept at the base of a tower in the hills of Dorne. The parties, Rhaegar of House Targaryen, Prince of Dragonstone, heir apparent to the Iron Throne of the Seven Kingdoms, Lyanna of House Stark, daughter of Lord Rickard Stark of Winterfell, Warden of the North. The officiant, a high septon, named, sealed with his personal ecclesiastical mark. The note at the bottom, in slightly smaller script, this record is held in the faith's formal archive at the Citadel. This copy was made at the request of the bride and given into her keeping. Should the original ever be disputed or suppressed, this copy bears the same seal and the same witness of the seven. The child, if there is a child, is true born. I write this because the woman asked me to, and because truth requires more than one home." Ned closed the book. He sat in the dark for a long time. He thought about all the things he had let people believe, about Catelyn's eyes on their wedding night, careful and distant, already measuring the cost of a husband who'd fathered a bastard before the vows were cold, about the 14 years of her controlled coldness toward a boy who had done nothing, who had never done anything, who had been born in a tower in Dorne and carried north in his uncle's arms, and given a smaller life than the one his blood demanded. He thought about Robert. He would have killed you. He'd told himself that for 14 years, and it was true. It was still true. Robert, in his grief and his anger and his need to unmake Rhaegar from the world, Robert would have looked at that baby and seen Rhaegar's face, and that would have been the end of it. A king's mercy was still a mercy. Robert would not have been merciful. But Robert was not the only threat anymore. Bran had fallen from a tower window. Ned was not certain who had pushed him. Certain enough. The Lannisters were in his castle. Cersei watched everything with those green eyes that gave nothing away, and Jaime laughed and watched the walls, and held his sword the way men hold swords when they're thinking about using them. Jon's secret had protected him when Robert was the danger. Robert was dying. Slowly, without knowing it, in the way that powerful men died, not by an enemy's hand, but by their own appetites, their own grief, the weight of a crown they'd won by conquest and carried by force of will for 17 years. And now the will was going. When Robert died, the Lannisters would move. Cersei's children would be announced as the heirs. Anyone who stood in that path would be removed. Jon Snow, bastard of Winterfell, was not in that path. Aegon Targaryen, rightful heir to the Iron Throne, was directly in it. The lie was no longer a shield. He put the ring in his pocket. He gathered the book and the letters and put them inside his cloak against his chest. He replaced the stone carefully, pressing the mortar back as best he could. Then he stood, took the torch, and walked back through the dark and the cold and the long corridors of dead Starks, and he went to find his wife. Catelyn was at the window when he came in, still dressed, a candle burning on the table beside her. She had been waiting. He had been in the crypts longer than he realized. He dismissed the servants without explanation. He closed the door, he turned the lock. She watched him do all of this and said nothing, which meant she had already decided the conversation was serious. Catelyn Tully read rooms the way her father had taught her to read rooms, by what was missing, by what moved wrong, by the small signals of controlled emotion in people who'd learned to control it. "Sit down," he said. "Tell me first. Catelyn, tell me what it is, and then I'll decide if I need to sit." He pulled a chair close to hers and sat himself. He put the box on the table between them. He took a breath that felt like the last breath before a cold plunge. "Jon is not my son." She went very still. "I need you to hear everything before you speak. I need you to let me finish because there is no point in the story where this becomes simple. And if you stop me before the end, you will only have the part that hurts and not the part that explains it. Then speak." Her voice was flat. Old anger settled into something harder than fresh anger. She had always known. She had always suspected. She had spent 14 years suspecting, and the suspicion had been its own kind of wound. She had been right, and being right about this was not a comfort. His mother was Lyanna. Not surprise, not grief, something more like the expression of a woman who has been carrying a question for 14 years and has just been handed the answer. And the answer is worse than the question, because questions can be endured, but answers have to be lived with. "Lyanna," she said. "Yes, your sister, yes, and his father, Rhaegar Targaryen. They were married. Cat. Before Jon was born. I have the proof." He placed the book on the table, opened it. A high septon performed the ceremony in Dorne. The original record is in the Citadel's archive in Old Town. Lyanna had a copy made and hidden here. The seal matches the high septon's known mark. A maester who examines it will confirm it. He paused. The King's Guard were at the Tower of Joy because they understood what that child was. They were protecting the king. Rhaegar's son was their king the moment he was born. "Ned," her voice had changed. "I know. You let me believe. I know. 14 years. The flatness cracked, not into tears, into something colder, more precise. I gave you 14 years of holding my tongue about that boy, of sitting across the table from him and saying nothing, of letting Robb grow up with a shadow at his shoulder. I did that because I believed you had dishonored me, and I decided to endure it because you were my husband and I had made my vows, and I am not my Aunt Lysa. I endure. Her hands were flat on the table, very still. And you let me believe it. I let everyone believe it, because Robert would have killed him. Don't, Cat. Look at me. He waited until she did. Robert loved Lyanna. Robert would have burned the realm to avenge her. If I had come home from the Tower of Joy with Rhaegar's son in my arms, that child would have been dead before he was old enough to crawl. I made a choice. I made it in a tower in Dorne with Lyanna bleeding out in front of me, and I have carried it every day since. And I would carry it again, but I am telling you now because the choice has changed. She looked at the book. She reached out and touched the edge of it, not the pages, just the cover. Read it, he said quietly. She read it. The candle burned down a thumb's width while she did. When she finished, she placed it back on the table and looked at the wall for a moment, and then looked at him. Joffrey isn't Robert's, she said. Her voice was careful, measured. Jon Arryn was investigating the succession before he died. That is why you accepted Robert's offer, isn't it? Not just for duty. Because you need to understand what Jon Arryn found, and whether it points where you think it points. Yes. She closed her eyes. He watched her put it together. The logic of it, the Tully political instinct that her father had sharpened in her from childhood, reading the succession the way a general reads terrain. Cersei's children, Robert dying, the Lannisters already in position at every door of power in King's Landing, already controlling the gold cloaks, already with a hand on the levers of every institution between the throne and the street. If Joffrey is declared king, she said slowly, and Robert dies before anyone can stop it, then it's Lannister rule, and anyone who knows the truth about Jon becomes a threat to be removed. Our daughters are going south with you. I know. Then we are not talking about politics. Her eyes opened. They were steady. The anger was still there. It would be there for a long time, he suspected, and he deserved it. But beneath it, something else had come up. Something that was Catelyn Tully at her most essential. The woman who would burn down the world for her children. We are talking about keeping Sansa and Arya alive. And that means Jon cannot be a bastard anymore. No, Ned agreed. He cannot. She stood, walked to the window, looked out at Winterfell in the dark, at her home, at the place that had been foreign to her once, and had become hers through 14 years of exactly the kind of endurance she had just described. The Tyrells, she said. He hadn't said it yet. He had been working toward it, but she had gotten there herself. Yes, Olenna Tyrell does not do favors, Ned. I'm not asking for a favor, I'm offering her the investment of a century. Catelyn turned from the window. Her face had changed again. The grief was still there, would not leave, but behind it now was something he recognized. The look of a woman who has decided, who has put down the things she was carrying and picked up the things she needed to carry instead. I want to see him, she said. Not tonight, not yet, but before this goes further, before any envoy rides south, I want to speak to Jon. Whatever I believed, I gave my coldness to a child who was carrying something none of us understood. He didn't choose what he was born into. Neither did I. She set the book down carefully. I owe him that at least. At the woman who had endured what he'd asked her to endure, without knowing why, for 14 years. When the Tyrells agree, he said. She nodded, picked up the book, read the Septon's final line again, truth requires more than one home, and set it back down. Then send your envoy, she said, and pray Olenna Tyrell is as clever as everyone says. She is, Ned said. Good. Catelyn moved toward the door, paused, did not turn, because if she isn't, we're putting our children in front of lions with nothing but roses for a shield. She left. Ned sat alone with the torch and the book and the ring. He put the ring on the table, looked at the 3 heads of the dragon, the old silver going dark at the edges, the craftsmanship of a world older than any living memory, Lyanna's. Whatever it had meant to her, it was hers now in the only way things could belong to the dead, through what remained of them in the living. He thought of her face on the stone statue in the crypt below him, the jaw, the eyes. Promise me, Ned. He had kept it. Now he had to do something harder. He had to spend it. Highgarden smelled like something Winterfell had no word for. Ser Roderick Castle had ridden 35 days to get here. Through the neck, through the riverlands, down the broad stone roads of the reach where the trees gave way to open sky and the fields ran gold and green to every horizon. He had slept in inns that smelled of warm bread and spilled wine. He had passed through villages fat with harvest, past orchards still heavy with fruit in the last weeks of autumn, through a land that seemed genuinely unaware that winter was a real thing that happened to real people. He was a man of the North. He had spent 60 years learning what cold felt like at the bone. This place unsettled him in the specific way that too much comfort always unsettled Northerners, not because it was unpleasant, but because it made you soft without your noticing. Highgarden's gates were open when he arrived. They were always open, a servant told him later. Lord Tyrell believed that closed gates suggested fear, and House Tyrell was not afraid of anything that used roads. Sir Roderick thought that was an attitude a man could afford when he had 100,000 swords behind him. He was received at the gates by a steward who gave no name, asked no questions, and led him through 3 separate gardens before they reached the castle's interior. The gardens were deliberate. He understood that. Every rosebush, every fountain, every carefully arranged sightline showing Highgarden at its most abundant. It was all argument. This is what we are. This is what we have. Consider carefully what you are asking us to risk. The steward stopped at the entrance to a 4th garden, smaller than the others, enclosed on 3 sides by high hedges trimmed to the shape of running horses. Lady Olenna will receive you here, the steward said. Lord Mace sends his apologies. He is attending to estate matters. Ser Roderick had met Mace Tyrell once, years ago. At a tournament, he accepted the apology without comment. He stepped through the gap in the hedge. She was already seated. That was the first thing. She had arranged to already be seated when he arrived, which meant she had been watching him walk through the gardens, timing it, and had chosen her position with the unhurried confidence of a woman who had never in her life been made to wait for anything she actually wanted. She was old. Older than he'd expected, though he'd been told her age. The years had not softened her. They had concentrated her, the way a long winter concentrates cold, burning away everything that wasn't essential until what remained was pure and very hard. She wore gray and pale gold, no jewels except a single rose pin at her collar, small silver, the kind of thing that cost more than it looked like. Beside her, standing rather than seated, a young woman in green and gold. Dark eyes, a face that understood it was being observed and had decided not to perform for the observation. She looked at Ser Roderick the way her grandmother was probably looking at him, as a quantity to be assessed. Margaery Tyrell, he had not been told she would be present. There were no other attendants, no guards. Either the hedges held soldiers he couldn't see, or Olenna Tyrell genuinely did not believe a 60-year-old master-at-arms from Winterfell was a threat worth guarding against. He suspected both were true. Ser Roderick Cassel, Olenna said, not a greeting, a confirmation. My lady, you've been on a horse for a month. You look like you've been turned inside out, and I won't have you swaying at me while I try to have a conversation. She gestured to the chair across from her without looking at it. Mace sends his apologies. I sent him away. My son is a good man and a poor listener, and what you've come to say requires someone who listens. Ser Roderick sat. Lord Stark sent his master-at-arms, Olenna said. Not his steward, not a maester, his master-at-arms. She turned the thought over like a stone she was checking for weight. A man whose face says, I have never lied about anything important, in the same way your lord's face does. He sent the most honest-looking man in his household. She looked at him directly for the first time, which means whatever is in that satchel at your hip is either genuine, or Lord Stark is a better deceiver than his reputation allows. Which is it? Both answers point to the same place, Ser Roderick said. My lord sent me because the thing he's asking you to consider cannot be put in a raven, and because a man who lies through his master-at-arms is a man who's put his most trusted servant in harm's way for a deception, and Lord Stark doesn't spend people that way. Then, without turning her head, Margaery. He means it, Margaery said simply. Yes, Olenna agreed. He does. She held out her hand, the satchel. She read slowly. That surprised him. He had expected the speed of a woman who had read everything worth reading and skimmed the rest. Instead, she went through each page of the copied registry entry with the deliberate attention of someone who understood that haste was for people who couldn't afford to be wrong. She did not speak while she read. Margaery walked the perimeter of the garden, hands folded behind her back, not looking at Ser Roderick, not ignoring him either, simply occupying herself in a way that kept her from reading over her grandmother's shoulder, which Ser Roderick suspected she badly wanted to do. When Olenna finished, she placed the document on the table between them. She did not close it. Fetch Septon Arneld, she said to no one visible. A figure materialized from behind the far hedge, not a guard, a servant, very still and very good at it, and disappeared. Olenna looked at the document, then at Sir Roderick. "The boy," she said. "What does he look like?" "He looks like Lord Stark, my lady. Dark hair. Gray eyes. He has Lady Lyanna's face, those who knew her say." A silence. "He doesn't look Targaryen." "No, my lady. Silver hair, purple eyes, the old blood showing itself." She tapped one finger on the table once, a single precise beat. "He looks like a Stark bastard. He was meant to. That was the point of it." She leaned back. "And Eddard Stark's honor, his famous, grinding, inconvenient honor, spent 14 years absorbing the damage of the lie, his wife's contempt, his own reputation, all to protect a child who looked enough like him that the lie would hold." She paused. "That's not the behavior of a man running a fraud, Sir Roderick. A fraud requires ambition. What Lord Stark did required only grief and stubbornness. Those, I believe." Septon Arneld arrived. He was younger than Sir Roderick expected, with ink-stained fingers and the slightly distracted look of a man interrupted mid-thought. Olenna handed him the document without explanation. He looked at the cover, looked at her, and began reading. The garden was quiet. A bee moved through the late roses at the hedge's base. Somewhere beyond the walls, a kitchen was producing something with cinnamon. "The seal," Olenna said eventually. Septon Arneld was already examining it, tilting the document to the light. He produced a small glass lens from his robe and looked through it at the impression in the dried wax. He turned 2 pages, read something, turned back. "Read the seal notation again." "It's his," the Septon said. "The personal ecclesiastical seal of the High Septon who held the office during the last years of Aerys's reign. I have seen authenticated correspondence from his tenure in the Citadel's records. The script matches his known hand. The seal matches his documented mark. The dating formula is consistent with his known practice." He looked up. "This is a faithful copy of an entry from the faith's formal registry of sacraments. The seal on the copy is the High Septon's own, placed here to authenticate the copy as genuine." He paused. "The original will be in the Citadel's archive in Old Town, if it has not been suppressed." Olenna looked at Sir Roderick. Sir Roderick said nothing because there was nothing to say. He had known what the document was. He had ridden 35 days because he knew what it was. "Thank you, Arneld," Olenna said. "Go away." The Septon went. Margaery came back from the hedge and took her position beside her grandmother. She had finished whatever calculation she had been running during the reading. Sir Roderick could see it in the set of her shoulders. Not conclusion exactly, but readiness. The readiness of someone who has decided to be interested rather than afraid. Olenna folded her hands. "Daenerys Targaryen," she said. "She's alive. Somewhere in the Dothraki Sea, last I heard, married to a Khal who could burn Lannisport if he pointed his horde at it. She has no fleet, my lady, no dragons, no Westerosi backing. She is not a factor at this point." "At this point," Olenna repeated. "I note the qualifier. Careful, man." She did not say it as a criticism. The North's military commitment, 20,000 soldiers, the fastest, most experienced cold-weather fighters in Westeros, first to formally declare for the rightful king, first swords sworn to the new dynasty before a single lord south of the neck had been asked. 20,000 northern swords, Olenna said, and Lord Stark as hand of the king, which puts the most trusted man in the realm between the boy and every political knife in King's Landing. She was quiet for a moment. "And the Tyrells become the house that restored the true dynasty. Margaery becomes not merely a queen, but the woman who made a king of a boy who had nothing but a copy of a document and a dead mother's ring." She looked at her granddaughter. "That's what's being offered." Margaery looked at Sir Roderick. "How old is he?" 14, my lady, 15 before the year is out." "Is he clever?" Sir Roderick considered this with the honesty of a man who had taught the boy to hold a sword. "He is Lord Stark's most serious. He listens longer than he speaks. He remembers what he's told, and he carries things without breaking under them." He paused. "He has been carrying things since he was old enough to understand what he was." Something had moved in her face when he'd said most serious, a small precise shift, as if the word had landed somewhere useful. "Grandmother," she said. "Yes. Send him away." Whatever passed between them in that look had been refined over years of exactly this kind of conversation. The two of them in a room, a decision to be made, the older woman checking whether the younger had understood the full weight of it, the younger woman indicating that she had and that she intended to carry it regardless. Olenna stood. "Sir Roderick," she said, "take a room for the night. Eat something. You look like a man who's been eating road rations for a month, and I won't have Lord Stark's envoy riding back to Winterfell looking like we starved him." She picked up the document. "I'll have this back to you in the morning with my Septon's written authentication attached, since Lord Stark will want that for the record." She paused. "Tell Lord Stark the Tyrells accept. And the terms, my lady? The formal terms?" "The formal terms are this. Margaery Tyrell weds the boy when he can put a crown on her head. Not before. We don't betroth our granddaughters to bastards. We betroth them to kings. Lord Stark makes the boy a king, then Lord Stark sends us a date." She looked at him with those old, hard eyes. "I trust that's clear enough." "Clear enough, my lady." Sir Roderick sat back down, because his knees had decided that standing any longer was an optimistic interpretation of their current capacity. Margaery remained. She picked up the silver ring from where Olenna had left it on the table. 3 dragon heads. She turned it in her fingers, examining the metalwork, the old Valyrian chasing, the way the silver had gone dark at the edges with age. "Lyanna Stark kept this," she said. Not a question. "It was in the box with the document, my lady. What it was to her, I couldn't say." Margaery set the ring down carefully in the exact center of the table. "He doesn't want to be king," she said. "Does he?" Ser Roderick looked at her. "No, my lady." "Good." She met his eyes. There was no performance in it now, no court face, just a young woman being precise about something she had thought about very carefully. Men who want thrones want them for what they give. Men who don't want them sometimes rule for what they owe. She stood, straightening her green and gold. A man who rules from debt rather than appetite is harder to buy, and much harder to manage. The corner of her mouth moved. "I've always preferred a challenge." She walked to the hedge, stopped. "Tell Lord Stark's boy," she said, "that when the time comes he should not be afraid of what he doesn't know. Everyone who sits that throne is afraid when they begin." She glanced back once. The ones who admit it last longer? She was gone. Ser Roderick sat alone in the garden with the bee and the roses, and the distant smell of cinnamon in the small silver ring catching the last of the afternoon light. He thought about the 35 days south, and the 35 days back, and the boy waiting in Winterfell who didn't know yet that his life had just changed in a garden in the Reach while he was training with a sword in the cold. He thought about what Lady Margaery had said, about debt rather than appetite, about men who ruled from what they owed. He picked up the ring, put it in his pocket. He rode out before dawn. He was hitting the same post he always hit. That was the thing Jon had noticed about himself sometime around his 12th year, that when he was thinking hard about something he couldn't resolve, his body defaulted to repetition, the same sequence: overhead, cross, thrust, overhead, cross, thrust. The post didn't move. The post didn't require adjustment or creativity or the particular alertness that a living opponent demanded. The post just stood there and absorbed it, and Jon could hit it for an hour without his mind being present at all. Ghost sat at the yard's edge watching him. The dire wolf had been watching him all morning, with that specific quality of attention that felt less like an animal observing its master, and more like something older considering something younger with patient, measured concern. Overhead, cross, thrust. Ser Roderick had returned 2 days ago. Jon had seen the old master-at-arms ride through the gates before dawn, seen the set of his shoulders and the careful, neutral expression of a man carrying news he hadn't been authorized to deliver yet. Jon had said nothing, had gone to the yard, had been hitting the post ever since, in the specific way of someone waiting for a thing they could feel approaching but couldn't yet see. Overhead, cross, thrust. "You're dropping your left shoulder." Jon stopped. Ned stood at the entrance to the training yard. He was alone, which was unusual enough at this hour, that Jon's chest tightened before his mind caught up with why. "I know," Jon said. "You've known for 2 years. You still do it. Only when I'm not thinking about it. That's precisely when it matters." Ned walked into the yard. He was not dressed for training. He was dressed for the cold, for being outside long enough that warmth had to be planned for. He looked at Jon the way he sometimes looked at Jon, with that careful quality, the extra beat before speaking that Jon had learned to recognize as the tell. The thing that said, "I am about to say something I have been carrying." "Walk with me," Ned said. The gods would. The gods would in late autumn was all bare branches and red leaves still clinging to the weirwood by stubbornness alone, the pale bark almost white against the gray sky. The pool was dark and still. The carved face in the heart tree looked the same way it always looked, like something that had decided long ago that patience was the only posture that made sense when you were going to outlive everyone who came to stand before you. They stood beside the pool for a moment without speaking. Jon had learned this too, that Ned's silences before difficult things were not hesitation, they were the last breath before weight. Your mother was Lyanna Stark. Jon heard it, let it sit. The words were simple and the words were enormous, and the space between hearing them and understanding them was longer than it should have been. Your father was Rhaegar Targaryen. They were married in Dorne before you were born. The ceremony was performed by a high septon, and the record is held in the Citadel's archive in Old Town. You are their true-born son. A pause. Your name, the name you were born with, is Aegon Targaryen. You are the rightful king of the Seven Kingdoms. The pool didn't move. Jon looked at the weirwood's face. The carved eyes, slanted and red-rimmed, looked back at him with the expression they always had, which was no expression at all, which was somehow exactly right because he had no expression either. He was waiting for one to arrive. Say something, Ned said. Quietly, I'm trying to find something to say. Take your time. Jon looked at his hands, the calluses from the practice sword, the small white scar across his left knuckle from the year he'd sparred with Robb Cassel, using real steel too early. His hands. He knew these hands. He had been building these hands for 15 years. Lyanna, he said, your sister, yes, she died. At the Tower of Joy, in Dorne. She was giving birth to you. Ned's voice did not waver, but something in it compressed the way wood compresses before it cracks. She made me promise to protect you, to keep you safe from Robert, from anyone who would kill a Targaryen child. He stopped. I gave you a smaller life than you were born to. I told myself it was protection. It was. But it was also the only thing I could think to do in a tower with my sister dying in front of me, and I have spent 14 years deciding whether that was wisdom or cowardice. I have never fully resolved it. Jon turned that over, the honesty of it. Most men, he thought, would have dressed it as pure sacrifice, would have made the choice sound clean. Ned was incapable of that, which was both his defining quality and the thing that had cost him more than most men ever paid. The wall, Jon said. Yes. I was going to take the black. I know. I had decided. He heard the past tense in his own voice and recognized it as the sound of something ending. I had made my peace with it. It felt right. A place where what you are born matters less than what you do. He paused. I wasn't running away. I want you to know that. I genuinely thought it was the right. I know that too. Ned looked at him directly. You were not running away. You were finding the best life available to the person you believed yourself to be. That is not weakness. It is the thing I raised you to do. Make the best choice with what you have. He held Jon's gaze. What you have has changed. Jon was quiet. A red leaf let go of the weirwood and fell to the pool and floated there in the still dark water, perfectly motionless. Robb, Jon said. Robb is the better man for this. Robb is not Rhaegar's son. That shouldn't be the whole argument. Robb is my heir, the Lord of Winterfell in waiting, the finest young lord in the north, and he will serve the realm well from Winterfell for the rest of his life. Ned's voice was patient, but not soft. He is not the rightful king, you are. Those are different things, and the difference is not about quality of character. It is about what the realm is owed. I don't know how to be a king. No one does, until they are one. That's not an answer. It's the only honest one. Ned turned to face him fully. Every king in the history of the Seven Kingdoms began without knowing how to be a king. The good ones learned. The bad ones refused to. The question is not whether you know. The question is whether you are willing to learn. Jon looked at the pool, at the red leaf floating perfectly still on the dark water. Sansa, he said. Ned said nothing. Waiting. Sansa and Arya are going to King's Landing. You're taking them south with you. He already knew this. Had known it since the day Robert arrived, since the feast, since the careful choreography of Ned accepting the hand position. If you fail, if the Lannisters move against you before you can, yes, they would use them as hostages, as leverage. Cersei would. It wasn't a question. She would use them to keep you compliant, and when you were no longer useful, she would. Jon, I need to say it plainly, then say it. If I go to the wall, my sisters have no protection beyond yours, and if yours fails. He stopped, looked at Ned. You walked into Aerys's court and you stood in front of him and told him the truth, because honor demanded it. You walked into Robert's war and you fought because duty demanded it. You are going to walk into King's Landing, and you are going to do the right thing every time the right thing presents itself, because that is who you are. And the Lannisters know it. They are going to use it. They are going to let your honor lead you somewhere you cannot get back from. Ned was very still. I know, he said. So my going to the wall is not just me choosing a smaller life, it is me leaving Sansa and Arya in front of lions, and telling myself I'm not responsible for what happens next. A long silence. The pool. The pale weirwood, the carved face watching them both with its long red eyes. Yes, Ned said, that is precisely what it is. It was the specific exhalation of someone who has followed an argument to the place it was always going and arrived there without detours. All right, he said. All right. Tell me the rest. Ned told him about Highgarden, about Ser Roderick's ride and Olenna's garden, and the Septon with the lens examining the copied registry entry. About Margaery Tyrell, who had sent him away and spoken to her grandmother alone and sent back an acceptance. About the terms, not a betrothal to a bastard, a wedding to a king. About the 40,000 Tyrell soldiers that would not march until there was a crown to march toward. Jon listened. He did not interrupt. This was the thing Ned had always valued in him, the quality that Robb Castle's boy didn't have and Theon certainly didn't have. The ability to let information arrive in full before demanding to respond to it. When Ned finished, Jon was quiet for a long moment. I don't know her, Jon said. No. Margaery Tyrell. I don't know her at all. You will. What do you know of her? Ned considered this honestly. She is her grandmother's work, which means she is intelligent, unsentimental, and more interested in what a situation can become than in what it currently is. He paused. Ser Roderick says she asked whether you were clever. Jon looked at him. What did he tell her? That you were serious? That you listened longer than you spoke? That you carried things without breaking? Jon absorbed that, and she accepted anyway. She accepted because of it. Ned put a hand on Jon's shoulder. The grip was brief and firm in the way that Ned's physical gestures of affection always were, not withheld, but compressed. Everything that couldn't be said publicly condensed into a single point of contact. She is not looking for a man who wants the throne. She is looking for a man who understands what the throne costs. There is a difference. Jon thought about that for a moment, turned it over. Catelyn, he said, she knows, does she? She asked to speak with you, before anything else moves forward. Ned removed his hand. She said she owes you that, her words, not mine. Jon looked at the weirwood, at the carved face that had been watching Stark stand in this spot and carry impossible things for 8,000 years. He thought about the boy he had been this morning, hitting the post in the yard, going to the wall in his mind for the 10,000th time, building the version of himself that would fit inside the Night's Watch, and the cold and the long empty horizon where he didn't have to be anyone's anything. That boy was still here. He hadn't gone anywhere. But the post was behind him now. I need a sword, Jon said. Ned looked at him. You have a sword. A real one, not a practice blade. He looked at his hands. If I'm going to be what you're asking me to be, I should be properly armed for it, when the time comes. Jon nodded. The nod was small and not triumphant in any way. It was the nod of someone accepting a weight, testing its distribution, deciding where to put their feet. All right, what do I need to learn? The training began that afternoon. Not swordsmanship, he had enough of that. Ned brought him to the Solar and put books on the table that had never been there before. The histories of Targaryen kings, the records of marriages and alliances that had built the dynasty from Aegon the Conqueror forward, the accounts of the councils, the wars, the succession crises, the moments when everything had held or broken depending on a single decision by a single man in a single room. Jon read without complaint. He read the way he trained, not quickly, not for pleasure, but with the focused attention of someone who understood that what he was doing now was preparation for something he could not afford to be unprepared for. 3 days later, Catelyn came to find him in the library. She stood in the doorway for a moment before she spoke. He looked up from the book. They looked at each other across the room with the full weight of 15 years of careful distance between them. May I sit? She said. He stood, which surprised her. He could see it in her face. Please, he said. She sat. He sat. The book was still open between them on the table, a page of Targaryen genealogy, names and marriages and the children they had produced, all the threads of blood and duty and consequence that had led in their long and winding way to this room and these two people and this silence that needed breaking. Catelyn looked at her hands, then at him. "I was wrong," she said, "about you, about what you were, about what I allowed myself to believe." She did not soften it or frame it or dress it in explanation. She delivered it the way Ned delivered difficult things, plainly without ornament, because she understood that ornament was a form of cowardice when the thing itself needed to be said. "You were a child. You had done nothing. And I gave you coldness because the coldness had nowhere else to go, and that was a cruelty I cannot undo." She stopped. "I am not asking you to forgive me. I am telling you that I know what I did, and that I am going to spend whatever time we have left in this castle making sure you go south better protected than you would have been if I had kept the coldness." Jon looked at her. He had thought about this conversation for years, had rehearsed 100 versions of it in the dark, in the way that people rehearse the conversations they're fairly certain will never actually happen. He had never rehearsed this version, the one where she simply told the truth without asking anything in return. "Thank you," he said. It was not enough, and it was exactly enough, and she seemed to understand that, because she nodded once and looked at the book on the table. "Aegon the Conqueror," she said, reading the page. "He came to Westeros with 3 dragons and 2 sisters and a plan that should not have worked. And it did. Because he understood that the thing he was offering, order, unity, an end to the petty wars of 7 kingdoms, was worth more to most lords than the pride of independence." She looked at Jon. "That is still true. The lords of Westeros do not love Targaryens. But they are exhausted by Lannisters, and they are frightened of what comes when Robert dies with no legitimate heir." She turned the page. "You are not Aegon the Conqueror. You don't need to be. You just need to be better than the alternative. And that bar," she said, with a precision that carried 15 years of watching Cersei Lannister operate from a distance, "is not as high as it looks." Catelyn stood. "Read the chapter on Jaehaerys I," she said. "The conciliator, not a conqueror, a builder. He ruled for 55 years and died with more allies than enemies, which no Targaryen before or since managed." She paused. "That is the model if you want my opinion." "I do," Jon said. She looked at him once more, not with warmth exactly. Warmth was going to take time, and they both understood that, and neither of them was going to pretend otherwise. But with something that was the beginning of its possibility. She left. Jon looked at the genealogy page for a moment. Then he turned to the chapter on Jaehaerys the Conciliator. He read until the candle burned out. The King's Road south smelled like horse and mud, and the particular staleness of too many people moving together through too many miles of nothing. Ned had ridden this road before. He knew its moods, the way it narrowed through the neck, the way it opened into the riverlands where the fields ran flat to the horizon and the sky got bigger than northerners were comfortable with. He knew the inns. He knew which fords ran deep in autumn and which bridges the Crown had been promising to repair for 30 years. He did not know this version of the road. This version had a secret in it. Sansa rode ahead with her septa, excited in the way that only Sansa could be excited, with complete and total commitment, her entire body oriented toward the destination, toward King's Landing and the court and the life she had been building in her imagination since she was old enough to understand what queens were. Arya rode behind, arguing with her horse. Between them, the household guard, the servants, the luggage carts, the grinding logistics of a lord's party moving south. Ned rode in the middle and watched the road, and thought about the raven he had sent before dawn on the day of departure. A single word, coded into a phrase about grain shipments, directed through a Tyrell relay point at Bitterbridge. The Tyrell host would not march on that signal. That was not what the signal meant. The signal meant, "We are moving. Begin your preparations." The board is being set. He thought about Jon. Jon had stayed at Winterfell. That was the arrangement. Jon remained north, continued reading, continued training, continued being Ned Stark's bastard son in every visible way while the pieces moved south. The plan required Jon invisible for now. It required patience from a boy who had just been told he was a king and then told to wait in a library in the cold. Jon had accepted it without argument. That had worried Ned more than argument would have. King's Landing arrived the way it always arrived. Smell first. 2 miles out, the wind shifted and brought the city with it. 40,000 people and their animals and their waste and their cooking fires and their industry, compressed inside walls on a promontory above the black water, producing a specific quality of air that no amount of familiarity ever made pleasant. Sansa wrinkled her nose and then arranged her face into an expression of sophisticated tolerance. Arya did not bother arranging her face. The Red Keep rose above it all, the towers catching the afternoon light, banners moving in the river wind. Baratheon crowned stag, Lannister lion, the gold and crimson of a city that had been running on Lannister money for so long it had started to look like Lannister property. Ned looked at the banners and said nothing. At the gates of the Red Keep, the steward met them. Behind the steward, a cluster of household staff, a knight of the Kingsguard in white, and, unexpected, not in the briefing, not in anything Ned had planned for this moment, a procession already settled into the outer courtyard. Rose gold and green, 500 knights in Tyrell livery, their horses stabled, their tents erected in the yard with the practiced efficiency of soldiers who had been here long enough to be comfortable. A Tyrell banner above the tallest tent, not aggressive, not militarily positioned, simply present the way a house sigil is present above a family's seat, as a statement of occupancy. They were already here, 2 days ahead of Ned's party, moving fast, light the honor guard Olenna had described. Not an army, not a threat, just 500 very well-armed men in someone else's courtyard making the point that they had been invited. Ned kept his face still. Cersei was at the top of the steps. She had come down to receive him herself, which was not protocol. The hand's arrival was a significant occasion, but not one that required the queen. She had come because she wanted to see his face when he saw the Tyrell contingent. She wanted to read him, he understood this, and gave her nothing to read except the expression of a man who had traveled a long way and was tired. Lord Stark. Her smile was the smile she deployed for people she was assessing. Welcome to King's Landing. I trust the road was kind. Roads are roads, Your Grace. He dismounted, bowed correctly. The city is as I remember it. We have had some additions since your last visit. Her eyes moved to the Tyrell banners, then back to him. Lady Margaery Tyrell arrived 2 days past. A courtesy visit, she tells us. Trade discussions. The smile didn't change. The Reach is always interested in expanding its arrangements with the Crown. Lady Margaery is welcome at court, I'm sure. Ned said, quite welcome. A beat, perfectly measured. Robert is resting. The maesters have been managing his condition. You will see him tomorrow. She turned to go, paused as if the thought had just arrived rather than having been prepared hours in advance. Oh, and Lord Stark, the small council meets in 3 days. We'll want your counsel on several pressing matters. The emphasis on pressing was light enough to be deniable. Do make yourself comfortable. She went inside. Ned watched her go. Then he watched the Tyrell banners moving in the river wind. 2 days. Margaery had arrived 2 days early, which meant Olenna had sent her ahead of the schedule, which meant Olenna had decided that being present before Ned arrived was strategically superior to arriving together. A message to Cersei that said, "We did not come with the Starks, we came independently, we are not their allies, we are simply here." The lie was elegant. Ned filed it away as the kind of thing Catelyn would have thought of, and he would not have. He went inside to find his rooms. Ser Roderick was waiting in the solar. Beside him, a young woman Ned didn't recognize. Tyrell green at her collar, the specific posture of a lady-in-waiting who had been trained to be invisible in rooms and had mastered it. She curtsied when Ned entered and held out a folded note. Ned took it. The woman left without speaking. The note was in Margaery's hand. He recognized it from Ser Roderick's description, clean, deliberate, the script of someone who had decided that penmanship was a form of argument. The roses are here. The army follows in 40 days. Do not move before then. We meet tomorrow, the gods would, before the 3rd bell. Come without guards. I will do the same. Below that, a single additional line that had not been in any briefing, any plan, any arrangement made in Highgarden. She knows something is happening. She doesn't know what. You have less time than 40 days to matter. Ned read it twice, handed it to Ser Roderick, who read it and fed it to the candle without being asked. She? Ned said. The Queen, my lord. Lady Margaery's woman says Cersei has had 3 different servants approach the Tyrell quarters with gifts and invitations since they arrived. She is mapping them, trying to understand the relationship between the Tyrells and the Starks before the relationship can be defined on our terms. She's been living in this city for 17 years, my lord. She knows when the furniture has moved. Ned went to the window, the courtyard below, torches being lit as evening came in. The Tyrell knights, moving between their tents in the easy way of soldiers, settled into a position they intended to hold. "Littlefinger," he said. "He came to greet me this afternoon, my lord. Very warm. Asked about the road. Asked whether Lord Stark intended to take up residence in the Tower of the Hand immediately or would require some days to settle." Sir Roderick's voice was the voice of a man describing something that smelled wrong. He also asked, very casually, whether Lady Margaery's arrival had been expected. "What did you tell him? That I was a master-at-arms and not a diplomat, and that he should ask someone who would know." "Good." Ned turned from the window. "He's already running the calculation. He knows the Tyrells don't make courtesy visits to queens they have nothing to say to. He knows my arrival and their arrival are too close together for coincidence." He thought for a moment, how quickly can information move from here to Casterly Rock? Fast Rider, 3 weeks. Raven, 3 days. Tywin Lannister could know the shape of this within 3 days of Littlefinger deciding to tell him, which meant they were not operating on Olenna's 40-day timeline. They were operating on whatever timeline Littlefinger's curiosity allowed them. Tomorrow, Ned said, the Godswood, before the 3rd bell. The Red Keep's Godswood was smaller than Winterfell's. No weirwood. The Andal kings who built the castle had refused to plant one, and the oversight had never been corrected. Just trees and a small clearing, and the relative privacy of a space that Southerners found gloomy enough to avoid. Margaery was there when Ned arrived, alone as promised. She wore dark blue, not Tyrell colors, deliberately not Tyrell colors, the choice of a woman who understood that this meeting had no livery. She looked at him the way Olenna had looked at Ser Roderick, assessing, quick, filing. "Lord Stark," she said, "Lady Margaery, we don't have long. She has people watching the Godswood. No preamble, no courtesy performance. Not inside it, she finds it distasteful, but the approaches are covered." She folded her hands. "The note I sent, you understand what I meant. You believe Cersei already suspects a connection between us. I believe Cersei suspects everything always and then works backward to evidence. She doesn't know what we are yet, but she knows we are something." Margaery looked at the trees. "She came to see me yesterday evening. Personally. Wine, friendly questions about Highgarden, very warm interest in my grandmother's health. She said it the way someone describes a predator being polite. She asked whether my visit had anything to do with the change in the hand." "What did you tell her?" "That my grandmother believed it was always wise to establish relationships with new administrations before they formed their opinions of you." She looked back at him. She didn't believe it, but she accepted it, because it is also true and she couldn't find the edge of the lie. Ned looked at her. She was 16, he remembered. 16, and speaking about Cersei Lannister the way a general discusses weather, as a variable to be accounted for, not a force to be intimidated by. "You said I have less than 40 days. Littlefinger visited my quarters this morning," Margaery said. "He brought flowers. He was charming. He asked about Highgarden's crop yields and whether the Reach had found reliable buyers for the autumn surplus." She paused. "He also asked whether I had met Jon Snow." The air in the Godswood changed. "He asked about Jon specifically," Ned said. "By name. Jon Snow, Lord Stark's bastard son. Had I ever met him, was he likely to come south with the Hand's household?" She held Ned's gaze. "He doesn't know what Jon is. But he has noticed that a Tyrell honor guard arrived in King's Landing 2 days before the Hand, and he is curious about the coincidence, and Petyr Baelish curious about a coincidence is more dangerous than most men certain of the truth." Ned thought about the room, about Littlefinger at the small council, his fingers in the city's money, his eyes in the city's corridors, his careful, persistent habit of being present at every point where information changed hands. "He'll go to Tywin," Ned said. "Not yet. He'll gather first. He wants to know what he's selling before he sets a price." Margaery's voice was precise without being cold. "But Lord Stark, when he does go to Tywin, and he will, because Littlefinger's loyalty is to his own position, and his own position is threatened by what we're building, Tywin will move, and Tywin moving changes everything. The 40 days are a comfort, not a guarantee." She looked at him steadily. "My grandmother plans for what should happen. I plan for what does happen." A pause. "Robert is dying. The maesters are managing his wounds, but the wounds are not the real problem. The real problem is 17 years of what the king has done to himself, and a boar's tusk found the seam in it. He has weeks, not months." She let that sit. When he dies, Cersei moves immediately. She has the gold cloaks bought. She has the Kingsguard. She has Joffrey. What she does not have yet is a plan for 500 Tyrell knights in her courtyard. The corner of her mouth moved. That uncertainty is our only advantage, and it expires the moment Littlefinger resolves it for her. Ned was quiet for a moment. "What do you need from me?" he said. "The document. The copied registry entry. Where is it? Safe. It needs to be accessible, not just safe. When the moment comes, we will have minutes, not hours, to present it before the throne room becomes a battlefield." She held out her hand, not demandingly, practically. "Let me hold it. My quarters are less obvious than yours, and Cersei has not yet decided I am the threat. She has decided you are. About the weight of a document that had been sitting in the dark long enough." He reached inside his cloak, put the copied registry entry in her hand. She took it without looking at it, put it inside her dress against her body. The way valuable things got carried by people who understood that the most secure location for something irreplaceable was one that required a specific kind of violence to access. "Lord Stark," she said. "One more thing. Yes, Jon." She said the name plainly, no performance around it. "When this breaks open, and it will break open messily in a room full of people who have everything to lose, he needs to be here. Not at Winterfell. Here. In this city, visible, real." She looked at him. "A claim without a claimant is a document. A claimant without a claim is a bastard. You need both in the same room at the same time, or Cersei simply denies everything and dares you to prove it in a war. Bringing him south now, before we're ready, brings him south while we can still control the conditions of his arrival." Her voice did not rise. It never rose. It got quieter when the point was sharper, which was its own kind of pressure. "Send for him. Today. Fast rider, not raven. A raven can be intercepted. A rider with a verbal message cannot be read by a maester at a relay castle." She straightened. "Tell him to come armed and to come fast, and to come as Jon Snow, Lord Stark's bastard, until the moment he doesn't have to anymore." She walked to the Godswood's edge, paused without turning. "My grandmother told me you were the most honest man in Westeros," she said. "I have been in this city for 4 days, and I have already understood why that quality is dangerous here." She glanced back once. "Trust me to be dishonest where dishonesty is required. That is what I am for." Ned stood alone in the Godswood, with the sound of the city beyond the walls and the weight of 40 days that were no longer 40 days, and the knowledge that somewhere north of the neck, a boy was reading about Jaehaerys the Conciliator and waiting to be sent for. He walked back to his solar. He wrote the message himself in his own hand, sealed it with his personal seal rather than the hand seal. He called for his fastest rider before the third bell had finished ringing. Robert came back from the hunt on a cart. That was the first sign. Not a rider with news, not a raven, but the sound of wheels on stone in the middle of the afternoon when the hunting party should have been 3 hours deeper into the Kingswood. The cart came through the outer gate with 4 gold cloaks walking beside it, and a maester already running from the keep before it had fully stopped, robe hitched at the knee, face doing the thing that maesters' faces did when they were calculating how bad something was, and had already arrived at the answer. Ned heard it from the Tower of the Hand. He was at his desk, reading a report on crown debt that Littlefinger had provided that morning, with a smile that suggested the report was accurate, and the accuracy was itself a kind of threat. He heard the wheels. He heard the silence that followed, the specific silence of a courtyard full of people who had all stopped what they were doing at the same moment. He went to the window. Robert was on the cart, conscious, which was something. His left side was wrapped in cloth that had stopped being white sometime in the last hour. His face was the color of old candle wax. He was speaking. Ned could see his mouth moving, could see the effort it cost, could see the maester bending close to catch the words. 2 of the hunting party rode behind the cart. Their faces said what faces say when they have watched something go wrong and are still working out how responsible they are. Ned left the tower. The royal chambers smelled like blood and poppy milk, and the particular staleness of windows kept shut against the cold. Robert was in bed by the time Ned arrived. The maester, Pycelle, old and careful and loyal to whoever was currently most dangerous, had cleaned the wound and packed it, and was explaining, in the tone of a man delivering news he had prepared for, that the boar's goring was significant, that the tusk had found a place beneath the ribs that was difficult to manage cleanly, that the king's constitution was strong, but that strong constitutions could only absorb so much when combined with the conditions of the past several years. Conditions was the word Pycelle used. He did not say 17 years of drinking yourself hollow. He said conditions. Robert looked at Ned from the bed with eyes that were clearer than they had any right to be. Ned. His voice was rougher than usual. The effort of projecting it cost him something visible. Closed the door. Pycelle looked between them. Out, Robert said. Pycelle went. The room was quiet. Outside, the city made its city sounds. Distant, indifferent. The noise of 40,000 people who did not yet know that the man in this bed was dying. "Don't look at me like that," Robert said. "Like what?" "Like you're already calculating what happens next." He shifted against the pillows, winced. "I've seen that face on you before. You wore it the whole last year of the war when you were trying to figure out what came after and were afraid to say it out loud. I'm not calculating anything. You're the hand of the king, Ned. You're supposed to be calculating." Robert looked at the ceiling. "It's bad, yes." Pycelle's poppy milk voice. "I know that voice. He uses it when he's decided someone isn't going to be a problem for much longer. A long exhale. I'm not going to make a scene about it. I want you to know that. I have been king for 17 years, and I was a better fighter than I was a king, and I am going to die the way I lived, which is badly and at the wrong time." He turned his head to look at Ned. "The children?" Ned said nothing. "Joffrey." Robert's jaw tightened. "Tell me the truth. You've been here 3 weeks. You've watched him. Tell me what you see." "A long moment. I see a boy who has never been told no," Ned said carefully. "By anyone, for any reason." Robert was quiet. The cloth at his side was darkening again, slowly at the edge. He didn't look at it. "Cersei," he said. "Yes." "And Jaime." Ned said nothing. Robert looked at him with those wax-pale eyes, and said nothing for a long time. He stared at the ceiling. His hands, big fighter's hands gone soft at the edges, gripped the bedding and released it and gripped it again. "I don't know," Robert said finally. His voice was low. "I have never wanted to know. That is the truth of it, Ned, and I am not proud of it. I have drunk myself half blind, and hunted myself into this bed, and never once looked directly at what was in front of me, because looking would have meant doing something, and doing something would have meant—" He stopped. The sentence had cost him. He breathed carefully. "She has never loved me. No. And the children, they are not." He stopped again, looked at Ned with those pale eyes. "Tell me." Ned thought about what he had found since coming south, about the book Jon Arryn had been reading before he died. A history of noble houses, their sigils and their bloodlines. About the pattern Jon Arryn had found, the same pattern Ned had confirmed. Every one of Robert's acknowledged bastards had black hair, not one exception. The seed is strong. The Baratheon blood ran black-haired through every line it touched. Joffrey was golden. Tommen was golden. Myrcella was golden. Jon Arryn found it, Ned said. That's why he's dead. He was investigating the succession, looking at the children, comparing them to your bastards across the city. Every child you've ever fathered has black hair, Robert. Every one. But Cersei's children don't, Robert said. Then, finish it. They are not yours. The room was very quiet. Robert looked at the ceiling for a long time. The city moved outside, distant, indifferent. Finally, he said, with the specific flatness of a man receiving confirmation rather than revelation, "Jaime, I believe so. And she has known, all this time. Not a question, yes." The cloth at his side needed changing. Neither of them mentioned it. "Then who sits the throne when I—" He opened his eyes, looked at Ned with an expression Ned hadn't seen on his face since the war. Raw, stripped of everything. No king's voice, just a man in a bed reckoning. "Stannis? Stannis is your heir by law. Gods." He was quiet for a moment. "Is there another option?" It was not quite a question. It was the specific phrasing of a man who suspects there is an answer and is deciding whether he wants to hear it. Ned looked at him. At his oldest friend, at the man he had fought beside and lied to for 14 years. The man who had loved Lyanna and would have killed her son for being Rhaegar's. The man who was lying in a bed with a boar's wound in his side, and perhaps 3 weeks to live, and who was looking at him now without defenses. "There is something I have to tell you," Ned said. "Something I should have told you a long time ago, and I need you to hear all of it before you speak." Robert looked at him. "Lyanna," Ned said. "I need to tell you about Lyanna." He told him everything. Not quickly, not gently either. Ned had never managed gentle when the thing being said was real. He told it the way he had told Catelyn plainly and in order, and he let Robert's face do what Robert's face needed to do without stopping to manage it. Robert did not speak for a long time after Ned finished. The cloth at his side needed changing. Neither of them mentioned it. She went willingly, Robert said. His voice was very flat. Yes, she loved him. Yes, the word landed in the room and stayed there. Ned watched Robert carry it. Watched the king, the man who had built his entire reign on the story of the woman stolen from him, the wrong that justified the war that justified the crown, carry the weight of a truth that unmade the story without unmaking the grief. Something crossed Robert's face then that Ned had not expected. Not anger, not the explosive rage he had braced for. Something worse, a long, slow exhaustion, the expression of a man who has been lifting something very heavy for a very long time and has just been told he could have set it down years ago. I would have killed the boy, Robert said. Yes, if you'd brought him to me. After the tower, I would have... He stopped, looked at his hands. How old is he? 15. 15. Robert breathed out. And he looks like a Stark. He looks like Lyanna. A long silence. Outside, a gull screamed over the black water. The city moved and breathed and went about its business. Show me, Robert said. Ned sent for Jon that night. Not a raven. A rider, his fastest. A man named Harwick who had ridden the King's Road in both directions enough times to know every relay point and every shortcut and every inn where a horse could be changed in the middle of the night without questions. Ned wrote the message himself and sealed it and put it in Harwick's hands, and said, "Ride until you reach him." Harwick rode. The small council met 2 days later. Robert had not appeared publicly since the hunt. The official account, that the king had been wounded by a boar while hunting, that the wound was serious and his recovery uncertain, was delivered by Pycelle to the assembled lords with the gravity it deserved. The city knew the truth of what that gravity meant before the announcement finished echoing. Ned took his seat at the council table. Across from him, Littlefinger, who smiled with his eyes in the way that meant he had spent the past 48 hours being very busy. Varys, whose face gave nothing, which meant he knew more than anyone and had decided to keep it until the price was right. Pycelle, ancient and cautious. Renly, who looked at Ned with an expression caught between calculation and something closer to genuine unease. Cersei sat at the table's head. Robert's seat, she had taken it without announcement, without ceremony, simply occupied it the way water occupies a space when the obstacle is removed. The king's recovery is in the Seven's hands, she said. In his incapacity, the council will manage the realm's affairs under my guidance as Queen Regent. The king is not dead, Ned said. No, but he is incapacitated, and the realm requires its hand to function in the king's incapacity. That is the purpose of the position. Ned kept his voice level. I will manage the realm's affairs, Your Grace, as the law requires. Wise the Circe's green eyes moved to him. Something behind them shifted. The assessment, the constant running calculation, recalibrating. Of course, she said, smooth, unreadable. The hand's authority is not in question. But she let it go, which told Ned two things. She was not ready to move yet, and she was waiting for something, information, probably, a signal from somewhere that the picture was complete enough to act on. He thought about Littlefinger's hands folded on the table, about the message that may or may not have already moved toward Casterly Rock. The council discussed grain shipments. Littlefinger presented numbers. The numbers were correct, and the correctness was itself a kind of warning, the warning of a man who wanted you to know he could be relied upon to be accurate when accuracy served him. After the session, as the council filed out, Littlefinger fell into step beside Ned in the corridor. The king's injury, Littlefinger said. Terrible thing. Boars are unpredictable. He said it with the sympathy of a man who had never found anything unpredictable in his life. I imagine you're thinking about succession. I'm thinking about the king's recovery, of course. A pause perfectly weighted. Lady Margaery's continued presence at court is noticed. The lords have begun to comment. He glanced at Ned sideways, the glance of a man checking whether his probe has found anything. The Reach sending an honor guard to King's Landing during a succession uncertainty is the kind of gesture that can be interpreted many ways. I imagine it can, Ned said. I would hate for it to be misinterpreted. He stopped walking. Ned stopped with him, because not stopping would have been its own signal. Littlefinger's voice dropped to the register of a man sharing a confidence. Lord Stark, I have been in this city a long time. I know where every door leads, and I know who is standing behind most of them. If there is something you are building here, some arrangement, some alliance, I would very much like to be useful to it, rather than in opposition to it." He smiled. "I am very useful when I am properly motivated." Ned looked at him. At the face that had been Catelyn Tully's childhood companion and had never stopped being something it shouldn't have been allowed to be. At the eyes that were always counting. "I will keep that in mind," Ned said. He walked away. Behind him he could feel Littlefinger watching, running numbers, adjusting. The most dangerous man in King's Landing standing in a corridor, doing what he always did, finding the shape of the thing in the dark so he could decide what it was worth and to whom. Ned reached the end of the corridor and turned the corner and let the expression he had been holding dissolve for exactly 3 steps before he rebuilt it. Jon was riding south. Robert was dying. Cersei was waiting. And somewhere in the city, Littlefinger had just decided that Ned Stark was hiding something large enough to sell. The 40 days Margaery had spoken of in the Godswood had always been optimistic. They had perhaps half that now, perhaps less. Ned walked back to the Tower of the Hand and sat at his desk and looked at the Crown debt report that Littlefinger had given him and thought about the city beyond the window. Its noise, its indifference, its 40,000 people who did not yet know that everything was about to change. He thought about a box behind a stone behind a statue. He thought about a promise made in a tower in Dorne. He thought about a boy on a horse riding south through the neck, carrying a name he hadn't been born with toward a city that didn't know he existed. "Come fast," he had written. He hoped it was fast enough. Jon arrived at the city gates before dawn. He had ridden 11 days without stopping for anything that wasn't strictly necessary. Fresh horses at relay points, 3 hours of sleep at a time in inn corners, food eaten in the saddle. Harwick had matched him without complaint, which Jon had appreciated because complaint would have required response, and he had needed the silence to think. He thought about kings, about J. Harris the Conciliator, who had ruled 55 years by understanding that the realm was not a thing to be seized, but a thing to be maintained, like a wall in winter. Constant attention, constant repair, the work never finished, and never finished mattering. He thought about Aegon the Conqueror, who had come to Westeros with 3 dragons and a clarity of purpose that Jon found both admirable and deeply foreign to his own nature. He thought about Lyanna Stark, who had died in a tower before he could know her, whose face he apparently wore, whose choice had made everything that followed both possible and necessary. He thought about Margaery Tyrell, who he had never met. At the gates, a boy of perhaps 12 in Tyrell green materialized from the shadow of the arch and looked at Jon with the professional assessment of someone who had been told exactly what to look for. "Jon Snow," the boy said. Not a question. "Yes, follow me." He turned and walked into the city without looking back. She was waiting in a courtyard Jon didn't recognize. Small, enclosed, the kind of space that existed in the gaps between the Red Keep's larger purposes. 2 Tyrell knights stood at the entrance with their backs to the interior, which meant they were watching out rather than in. Margaery Tyrell stood in the center of the courtyard alone. She was not what he had expected. He was not certain what he had expected. Something more performed, perhaps. The court version of a lord's daughter, beauty arranged for effect. Instead, she looked at him the way Sir Roderick had described her grandmother looking at things, with the full attention of someone who was building an accurate picture and would not accept a flattering one. He dismounted. She looked at him for a long moment without speaking. "You do look like a Stark," she said. "So I've been told. It's a problem and a solution depending on who's in the room." She walked toward him, stopped at a distance that was neither intimate nor formal. "You rode 11 days. 12. Counting the last half. Are you tired?" "Yes." "Good. Tired men don't perform. I need to know what you actually are, not what you've prepared to show me." She said it without apology, the way she apparently said most things. "My grandmother assessed Lord Stark's master-at-arms and decided the proposal was genuine. I am going to assess you and decide whether the proposal is viable. Those are different questions." Jon looked at her. "And if you decide it isn't? Then we find a different approach." She said it without drama. "I don't commit to things that can't work. It's not personal. A man who understands that the throne is a burden before it is a prize. A man who will listen when people who know more than him are speaking. A man who is afraid of the right things." She paused. "Are you afraid?" "Yes." "Of what specifically?" "About Catelyn in the library, reading the genealogy page. About the crypts in Ned's voice and the sound the word Aegon made when it first landed on him. about Sansa and Arya, who were somewhere in this castle who he had ridden 12 days to be in the same city as, not for the throne, not for Rhaegar's legacy, but for the specific practical reason that they needed someone between them and the thing that was coming. Of being in a room when something goes wrong, he said, and not being enough. Margaery looked at him for a moment. That's the right answer, she said. The wrong answer is not being afraid at all. She turned and walked toward a door at the courtyard's far end. Come, we don't have much time and there's a great deal you need to know before tomorrow. What's tomorrow? She glanced back once. Everything, she said. Robert died in the night. Not dramatically, not with last words or a gathered court, or the weight of ceremony that 17 years of kingship might have earned him. He simply stopped, somewhere in the dark hours when the city was quiet enough to hear the river, his body finally arriving at the conclusion it had been approaching for years. Pycelle sent word to the Tower of the Hand before the body was cold. Ned was already awake. He dressed in the dark, sent 3 ravens, Winterfell, the Tyrell relay at Bitterbridge, and a third to a small inn south of the city where a rider was waiting with a horse already saddled. Then he walked to the Tyrell quarters himself, knocked twice on a specific door, and said 4 words. It has to be today. The great sept of Baelor smelled of incense and cold stone, and the accumulated prayers of generations. They came in before the city woke. Ned's household guard, 30 men in stark gray, the Tyrell knights, not all 500, 40 enough to line the sept's nave in Tyrell gold green without being an army. The small council, summoned by the Hand's authority under the pretense of a succession discussion, the senior septons, who had been waiting for this conversation since Jon Arryn's death, though none of them knew it yet, and the maesters, 3 from the Citadel's King's Landing chapter, brought specifically because their function in Westerosi law was to witness and record. Cersei arrived with Joffrey and the Kingsguard and 40 gold cloaks, and a face so carefully controlled it had gone past expression entirely into something harder, the face of a woman who had spent a night calculating and had arrived at a number she didn't like. She looked at the Tyrell knights lining the nave, counted them, looked at Ned standing at the altar with Margaery to his right and Ser Roderick behind him, looked at the High Septon in his full vestments, already positioned, which meant someone had spoken to him before dawn, which meant this had been arranged before Robert was cold. She said nothing. She took a position to the left of the nave with Joffrey beside her and the Kingsguard behind her, and waited, because waiting was the only play left that didn't start a battle in a sept. Joffrey put his hand on his sword. Sir Loras Tyrell, standing 3 feet away, did not move, did not speak, simply turned his head and looked at Joffrey with the expression of a man who had killed enough people to be genuinely relaxed about the prospect. Loras was young and gifted and one of the finest swords of his generation. Gifted enough that Joffrey, who was 12 and had never been in a real fight in his life, had no difficulty arriving at the correct conclusion. Joffrey's hand left the sword. Ned did not give a speech. He gave testimony. He stood before the altar of the mother, appropriate, he had thought, when Margaery suggested it, because testimony about birth before a figure representing care, and he spoke plainly, in the voice he used when there was no version of this that was easy, and the only remaining variable was whether it was said clearly or not. He described the Tower of Joy, the 3 Kingsguard, Dane, Went, Hightower, and why their presence at a dying woman's bedside meant what it meant. Men sworn to protect the royal family did not abandon their posts to guard a lord's daughter unless they understood that what she carried was royal. He described Lyanna, the blood, the promise. He described the decision he had made in that tower, and the 14 years that followed it, and he did not dress the decision as pure heroism, because it was not pure heroism, it was a man doing the only thing he could think of and living with the consequences. He presented the document, the copy of the High Septon's registry entry, the Septon's own seal applied to authenticate it, with the note that the original remained in the faith's formal archive at the Citadel in Old Town, available for verification by any maester sent to examine it. The High Septon took it with the careful hands of a man who understood he was holding a document that would be cited in histories not yet written. He read it, conferred quietly with the 2 maesters flanking him, their grey robes rustling in the cold air of the nave. One of the maesters produced a lens, another opened a case of reference documents, historical seals, authenticated signatures, the archival materials of a civilization that kept records because records were how civilization remembered itself. The process took 50 minutes. The sept was very quiet for 50 minutes. The incense burned. Somewhere outside, the city was beginning to wake. the first sounds of it drifting through the high windows, the distant movement of a world that did not yet know what was being decided in this building. Cersei did not move. She stood with her arms folded and her face controlled and her eyes on Ned with the specific attention of a woman memorizing details for future use, and Jon, standing in the shadows of the side aisle where Margaery had positioned him, watched her and thought about Jaehaerys the Conciliator, who had ruled 55 years by understanding which enemies could be made into allies and which ones could only be survived. He had not decided yet which category Cersei was in. The High Septon turned. The seal is genuine. His voice carried in the nave without effort, the voice of a man trained since boyhood to fill stone spaces. The record is authentic. The copy before us bears the personal ecclesiastical seal of my predecessor, applied by his own hand to verify the copy is faithful to the original registry entry held in the Citadel's archive in Old Town. The script, the dating notation, and the seal have been examined and confirmed by the maesters of the Citadel's King's Landing chapter, whose function it is to serve as the realm's witnesses in matters of legal record. He placed the document on the altar of the Mother with deliberate care. In the eyes of the Seven and in the records of the faith of the Seven Kingdoms, the marriage of Rhaegar of House Targaryen and Lyanna of House Stark was valid and lawful. Their son is true-born. His legitimacy is not a question of politics or power, it is a matter of religious and legal record established and witnessed. He turned toward the side aisle. Let him come forward. Jon walked out of the shadows. He had thought, in the 11 days of writing, about what this moment would feel like. He had imagined something clarifying about it, some internal shift, some arrival at certainty. Instead, it felt exactly like every difficult thing he had ever done, which was one foot and then the other foot, and the ground being real under each step. He walked to the altar. He looked at the assembly, the lords, the maesters, the septons, the 40 Tyrell knights in their gold green. Ned, whose face was the face of a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and had just set it down and was not yet certain how to stand without the weight. He looked at Cersei. She looked back at him with those green eyes that gave nothing, and he held her gaze long enough to say without words that he had been told what she was and he was not afraid of it. He looked at Joffrey, who was looking at him with an expression that was trying to be contemptuous and not quite managing it. He looked at Margaery, who was watching him with the focused attention of someone checking that a plan is executing correctly and finding, with small satisfaction, that it is. From the nave's far end, a voice, one of the northern lords who had come south in Ned's party, an older man whose family had sworn to the Starks since before anyone currently living could remember. The king in the north. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The sept's acoustics took it and spread it across the stone. Then Margaery Tyrell stepped forward. This was not in any arrangement Ned had made. Jon could see it in Ned's face, the slight adjustment of a man registering something unscripted. Margaery walked from her position at the altar's side to stand before Jon, and she looked at him for one moment with that direct, assessing gaze, and then she spoke to the assembly in a voice that was clear and calm and completely certain. The king of all Westeros. She knelt. The Tyrell knights knelt together, 40 men in gold green, the sound of it a single low concussion of metal and leather against stone that moved through the sept like a wave. Then the northern lords, one by one, then in groups, the calculation of survival running through each man's face in the moment before his knee touched the floor. The maesters remained standing. Their function was to witness, not to swear, but their stillness was its own kind of acknowledgement. The small council members, Renly, who knelt with the expression of a man revising a plan he had spent months constructing. Varys, who knelt with the expression of a man who had known this was coming and had arranged himself accordingly. Pycelle, who knelt slowly, his old knees making the process a minor spectacle. Littlefinger did not kneel immediately. He stood for 3 seconds longer than anyone else, his eyes moving between Jon and Margaery and Ned and the door, running the calculation one final time. Then he knelt, smoothly, with the practiced grace of a man who had decided that survival required flexibility, and that flexibility was, in the end, simply a form of intelligence. Cersei did not kneel. She stood with her arms folded, and her face controlled, and Joffrey rigid beside her. And she looked at Jon with those green eyes, and the thing in them was not fear, and it was not defeat. It was the patient, cold attention of a woman filing information away for later. Sir Loras Tyrell stepped forward, and stood between Cersei and the door with his hand at his sword, and his face perfectly pleasant. Jon looked at the assembly, At the bent heads, and the stone floor, and the incense smoke drifting toward the sept's high windows and the pale morning light coming through them, he did not feel like a king. He felt like a boy from Winterfell standing in a building full of people who had just made a decision that none of them could take back. He thought about what Margaery had said in the courtyard. Tired men don't perform. He had not performed. He had simply walked to the altar and stood there and let the truth be said around him, because the truth did not require his performance. It only required his presence. He thought about what Ned had said in the Godswood. No one knows how until they are one. He looked at Ned. Ned was looking at him with an expression that Jon would carry for the rest of his life. Not pride exactly, though it was in there, something more complete than pride. The expression of a man who made a promise in a tower in Dorne to a dying girl, and kept it for 14 years in the dark, and has just kept it for the last time in the light. Jon turned back to the assembly. "I want to know," he said, "who pushed Bran?" The Sapt was very quiet. In the silence, Cersei's face moved for the first time, not much, not enough for most people in the room to catch. But Jon was watching for it, and he saw it, the small involuntary contraction around the eyes, the tell of a woman whose calculations have just been interrupted by a variable she did not expect. Jon filed it away. Behind Cersei, being held at the nave's entrance by 2 Tyrell knights, Jaime Lannister stood in his white Kingsguard armor, with his hand at his sword and his golden face doing something it very rarely did. It was afraid. Tywin Lannister did not march in anger. That was the first thing Randyll Tarly told Jon when the intelligence came in from the Western Scouts. 3 riders arriving at the Coalition's forward camp in the hills above the Rose Road, with dust on their cloaks, and the specific exhaustion of men who had been moving faster than they wanted to for longer than was comfortable. He waited, Tarly said. He spread the scouting report on the campaign table without ceremony, a flat-topped boulder that someone had been using for this purpose long enough that the surface had worn smooth. 4 weeks after King's Landing, he concentrated his forces, resupplied, received his intelligence. He put a finger on the rough map. He is moving with 30,000 men in good order on the Gold Road, and he has turned south here toward the Rose Road because he understands that the Rose Road is how we supply King's Landing, and if he cuts it, he cuts us. Jon looked at the map, the roads, the hills, the river crossings, the geography of a battle that hadn't happened yet. He's not trying to take the city by direct assault, Jon said. No, he's too careful for that. 500 Tyrell knights inside the walls, the red wine fleet on the water, the city's food stores controlled by Reach supply chains. Assault costs him 10,000 men minimum and gains him a city that will starve him out within the month. Tarly's voice was the voice of a man who had run this calculation so many times it had become a kind of contempt. He wants to cut the supply lines, establish a fortified position in the field, and wait for the coalition to fracture politically. He is betting that the lords who knelt in the Sept will recalculate when they see a Lannister army camped 20 miles from their gates. Will they? Tarly looked at him with the flat assessment of a man who had been looking at lords his entire life. Some of them, which is why we cannot allow him to establish the position. He picked up the scouting report and set it down again. We need to intercept him before he reaches the road junction at Tumbleton. Past that point, the terrain opens and his numbers become decisive. Before it, the hills and the river bends work for us. How long? If he maintains current pace and we move tonight, we arrive at the Tumbleton approach 12 hours ahead of his vanguard. Tarly paused. If we move at dawn, we arrive as he does. We move tonight, Jon said. Tarly looked at him for one beat, the look of a man checking whether the person he is serving has understood the cost of a decision, and then nodded once, the nod of a man who has received the answer he expected and is already past it. Tonight, Tarly agreed. I'll brief the cavalry commanders. He left. Jon stood at the boulder table alone. The camp moved around him. 3,000 northern soldiers who had been marching for 2 weeks, who were tired and cold and far from home, who had followed Ned Stark's summons south because Ned Stark was the Lord of Winterfell and his word was sufficient. They did not yet know what Jon was. They knew him as Lord Stark's son riding with the advance force. That was enough for now. Ghost sat at the edge of the tree line, red eyes steady, patient, not sleeping. He never seemed to sleep when the air had this quality, the particular charge of a night before something. Jon went to find his sword. The northern scouts moved through the dark like water. Jon had trained with them for the better part of 2 weeks, learning their particular vocabulary, hand signals, bird calls, the way information moved through a forest at night without sound. They were not the Night's Watch Rangers he had imagined joining once, but the instinct was the same, the wilderness intelligence of men who understood that a landscape was not backdrop but language, and that learning to read it was the difference between surviving and not. He moved with the forward element himself, over Tarly's initial objection. "You are the king," Tarly had said, with the tone of a man pointing out a structural problem in an engineering plan. "Kings do not scout. This king does," Jon had said, until he has enough people who know what he looks like to make it impractical. Tarly had looked at him for a long moment. Don't get killed before the Sep's investment is recouped. It was, Jon had understood, the closest Randyll Tarly came to expressing concern for another person's welfare. The vanguard of Tywin's column was exactly where the scouts had predicted, moving in good order along the road's northern verge, torches extinguished for the last miles. The particular discipline of a force that had been trained by a commander who understood that professionalism was its own force multiplier. 3,000 men, cavalry at the front, supply carts at the rear, the spacing between units precise enough to suggest that someone very competent had drilled it into them. Jon watched them from the ridge above the road for 20 minutes, watched the spacing, watched the cavalry's formation, watched the points where the road bent and the trees came close and the ground dropped away into the shallow river valley on the eastern side. He went back to Tarly. "The ravine," Jon said. He pointed on the map. "Here the road bends left and there's a drop on the right side of perhaps 30 feet into the river. If the cavalry is pushed right at the bend, they go into the ravine," Tarly said. He was looking at the map with the focused attention of a man whose mind was already running the sequence. They can't deploy, can't charge, the infantry can't advance past them because the road is blocked. He looked up. "You are on the ridge." "Yes. I told you not to go past the first marker." "I know." A pause. "How many archers do you need?" 300. "In the tree line above the bend. Not to kill, to push. Volley fire into the leading cavalry, force the rear elements to drive forward into the front, compress the column at the bend point." Jon looked at the map. When they compress, the heavy horse hits them at the oblique. They're already disordered, already pushed right, already half in the ravine before anyone understands what's happening. Pavo, Tarly was quiet for a moment. "The oblique angle," he said. "At the bend, the ground favors a charge from the northwest, not the north. Most cavalry commanders attack from the north because the road logic suggests it." He pointed. "Here, if the Tyrell heavy horse comes from the northwest, they hit the compressed column at the point of maximum disorder, and the Lannister cavalry has nowhere to reform because the ravine is on their right, and the archers are on their left, and the road is blocked ahead." "Yes," Jon said. Another pause, longer this time. "I'll place the archers," Tarly said. "You will be with the reserve, behind the heavy horse." He looked at Jon with those flat, assessing eyes. Not a request. Jon accepted it. He was not a general. He had been very clear with himself about that, had held it as a fixed point through all the planning and writing and map work of the past 2 weeks. He knew what he could see, and he knew how to describe it, and he knew when to defer to a man who had been doing this for 30 years. He went to find his position. The archers were in place before the vanguard reached the bend. Jon waited with the reserve on a low rise behind the heavy horse. 8,000 Tyrell cavalry in full plate, the finest in Westeros, their horses moving with the controlled energy of animals that had been trained for exactly this purpose and knew it. Sir Loras Tyrell commanded the cavalry. He had arrived from King's Landing 2 days before with the main Reach host, 5 days ahead of Tywin's column, which was the margin Tarly had called for and gotten. The vanguard reached the bend. The archers released. The sound of 300 bows was not the sound Jon had expected. Not a single crash, but a sustained rush, like a wave finding a beach, rising and then a different sound altogether as the volley found the leading cavalry. Men and horses crying out, the ordered column suddenly not ordered, the front elements pulling up, and the rear elements driving into them, because the rear elements could not see what had stopped the front. The compression happened fast. Too fast, almost. The Lannister cavalry bunching at the bend, horses screaming, the road width insufficient for the mass of men and animals trying to occupy it simultaneously, the ravine edge crumbling at the right shoulder as the pressure pushed outward. A second volley. The pushing intensified. Then Sir Loras brought the heavy horse. Jon heard it before he saw it. the particular ground tremor of 8,000 horses accelerating, the sound that had no real analogy in any experience that didn't involve standing adjacent to it, a sound that was more physical sensation than noise. The Tyrell cavalry came out of the dark to the northwest at the angle Tarly had chosen, hit the compressed Lannister column at the bend, and the thing that happened next was not so much a battle as a consequence. The vanguard broke in under 4 minutes, the retreat ran backward through the main column like a message, each element reading the disorder ahead and making the calculation that broke formations, the individual soldier's calculus of whether the person next to him was going to hold, and finding the answer insufficient and moving. Tywin Lannister did not panic. Jon could see the command element far back in the column, the standards, the torches, the controlled movement of a general understanding what had happened and deciding what came next. Tywin pulled his center back, reformed his rearguard, and retreated in the specific order of a man who had lost the engagement and was determined not to lose the army. The Reach cavalry pursued to the edge of Tarly's designated boundary and stopped. No further. Tarly had been explicit. The objective was denial, not destruction. Pursue past the boundary and the terrain reversed, the advantage shifted, and 8,000 cavalry in the dark became a liability. The pursuit stopped. The road was quiet. Jon rode down from the rise through the aftermath. The bend in the road was a landscape of disorder, broken equipment, riderless horses standing in the dark, the particular wreckage of a formation that had been assembled with great care and had come apart in 4 minutes. The ravine below held what the ravine held. He did not look into it for long. Tarly was at the bend when Jon arrived, already receiving reports, already building the picture of what the night had cost both sides. His face gave nothing, but his posture had the slight easing of a man whose calculation had proven correct. The column, Jon said, in retreat. Good order, which is what you'd expect from Tywin. Tarly folded the first report and took the second from the rider. He lost his vanguard cavalry and approximately 400 infantry in the initial compression. His supply line is intact. He pulled it back before it was exposed. He looked up. He will reach Casterly Rock in 3 weeks. He will refit. He will think. And come back? Perhaps, but not on this road, not with this plan. Tarly looked at the bend, at the ravine, at the geography that had made the night possible. He understands now that the road is held, that the coalition has the terrain intelligence and the cavalry to deny him the field approach. His next move will not be military. He handed Jon the second report. It will be financial, it will be political. It will be whatever Tywin Lannister does when he cannot win with swords. Jon read the report. The numbers, the positions, the confirmed retreat. He folded it and gave it back. He's not finished, Jon said. No. Tarly took the report. Men like Tywin Lannister are not finished until they are dead, and sometimes not entirely then. He looked at Jon with the flat measuring gaze he had used every day of the 2 weeks they had spent together, checking, always checking whether the person he was serving had understood the full weight of what was being carried. You saw the ravine from the ridge. You came back and described it accurately and described the use of it correctly. That is not nothing. He paused. The pause had a quality Jon had not heard from him before, something that was not quite warmth but was adjacent to it, the way a northern winter morning is adjacent to cold without being its worst version. He listens. He doesn't argue with men who know more than he does. When the report came back wrong at the Mander crossing, he adjusted without being told. Tarly said it to the knight rather than to Jon, the way a man states a conclusion he has arrived at independently and has decided to let stand. He might make a soldier. Jon looked at the road, at the bend, at the dark tree line where 300 archers were already moving back to their positions, with the quiet efficiency of men who had done what they came to do. He thought about the night's watch, about the wall in his imagination, the clean horizon, the life that had felt like the right one for the person he had believed himself to be. That life was gone. Had been gone since the gods would in Winterfell, since Ned's voice saying Aegon Targaryen and the red leaf falling on the still dark water. This was what remained. This road, this night, this general who had just called him something he had never been called, in the plainest possible language without intending it as a compliment but delivering it as one, regardless. What comes next? Jon said. We hold the road, Tarly said. We maintain the supply lines to King's Landing. We wait for the siege to accomplish what the field could not. He looked west, in the direction Tywin had gone, and we prepare for whatever he tries when the waiting becomes intolerable. He turned back to the camp. Get some sleep. We moved to the Tumbleton position at dawn. He walked away. Ghost appeared from the tree line without sound and stood beside Jon. The direwolf looked west in the direction Tywin had retreated, ears forward, reading the dark. Jon put his hand in the white fur. Cold night air. Real ground. A battle won and a war not finished. I know, he told Ghost. He went to find his bedroll. The city had been decorating for 3 days. Not because anyone had ordered it, exactly. There had been an official proclamation, roses and wolf banners along the processional route, the great sept dressed in white and gold for the ceremony. But the decorating that meant something was the other kind, the kind that happened in the streets, in the flea-bottom alleys, and the candlemakers' quarter, and the dockside markets where people who had no reason to love any king had found reasons to mark the occasion anyway. Flowers in window frames, crude drawings of dragons and roses chalked on alley walls, the particular noise of a city that had decided, without being told to, that something was different about this one. Jon noticed it from the window of the anteroom, where he had been standing for 20 minutes, not quite managing to move. He was dressed in gray wool and black iron, and the Stark Targaryen cloak that Catelyn had commissioned from Winterfell's best seamstress, who had ridden south with the household and worked for 2 weeks to get it right. Gray as northern stone, with the 3-headed dragon chased in black thread at the hem and collar, not the full Targaryen red and black. Not yet, not until the coronation completed what the wedding began. The cloak was transitional. It was him at this moment, which was a man standing between what he had been and what he was becoming and not fully inhabiting either. Sir Roderick stood by the door with his hands folded, and his face doing the thing it did when he was concerned and had decided that concern was not useful. "You're not going to faint," Sir Roderick said. "I know," Jon said. "You look like you might." "I won't." Jon turned from the window. "I've been in battles." "Yes, and before battles you are calm." Sir Roderick had the tone of a man who had observed this and found it slightly unnerving. "This is different." "How?" "In battles," Sir Roderick said carefully, "the worst that can happen is you die. In there." He gestured toward the sept's inner doors. "The worst that can happen is you say the wrong thing in front of every lord in the 7 kingdoms, and the High Septon and Lady Olenna Tyrell, who will remember it in precise detail for the rest of her life and yours." "That was meant to be reassuring," Sir Roderick said. "Was it? I may have miscalculated the approach." He straightened. "You are ready. You have been ready for weeks. The only thing standing between you and the ceremony is that door and your own feet, and both of them will cooperate if you ask them to. The city below, the chalk dragons on the alley walls, the flowers in the window frames, 40,000 people who had no idea who he was 3 months ago, who had woken up this morning and put flowers in their windows." He thought about Lyanna, not the statue in the crypt, the real one, the one he would never know, who had made a choice in a world that gave women very few choices, and had made it completely without reservation, and had paid the full price of it. He thought about whether she would have wanted this for him, the sept, the cloak, the city decorating itself. He decided she would have wanted him alive. Everything else was secondary to that, and alive he was. "All right," he said. He walked to the door. The great sept of Baelor in full ceremony was a different building from the one Jon had stood in 2 weeks ago. Then it had been cold stone and incense, and the specific gravity of a legal proceeding. Now it was light. 1,000 candles in the chandeliers, the morning sun coming through the high windows at an angle that made the white marble floor luminous. The assembled lords and ladies in their best colors, arranged along the nave like a garden that had been sorted by house and told to be decorative. Jon walked in from the side entrance with Ned at his left. The assembly turned. The sound of it was not applause, too formal for that, too Westerosi, but the collective shift of 500 people reorienting toward the same point had its own quality, its own weight. Jon looked ahead, at the altar, at the High Septon in his crystal crown and white robes, at the 7-pointed star in colored glass behind the altar that was throwing its light across the marble in pieces, blue, gold, green, red, all the colors of the 7's aspects landing on the floor, and the people standing on it without preference or pattern. He did not look at the lords. He looked at the altar and he walked toward it, 1 foot and then the other, the ground real under each step, and when he reached his position he stopped and breathed and waited. The doors at the far end opened. Margaery walked the nave alone. No father, her father Mace, was present in the assembly, in his place as Lord of Highgarden, not as the man giving her away because Margaery Tyrell was not a thing being given. This had been her decision and Olenna's decision together, and no one in the building was confused about what it signified. She wore Tyrell gold and green, the colors of the Reach, flowers worked into the fabric at the hem and the collar and throughout her dark hair. Real flowers, small white ones, and roses, deep red ones that had been preserved despite the season. She had not adopted Targaryen colors for her own wedding. Jon had known she wouldn't. She had told him, in one of the late evenings they had spent talking in her quarters with a Tyrell guard outside the door, that she intended to come to the marriage as herself rather than as an appendage, and that she trusted he would not find this threatening. He had told her he found it sensible. She had looked at him for a moment and then smiled. Not the court smile, the real one, briefer and less arranged, and said that sensible was an excellent quality in a husband. She reached his side, looked at him. "You didn't faint," she said, quietly, "for him only. You're not the first person to raise that concern today. Does that concern you?" Less than it did 20 minutes ago. She looked forward toward the altar, toward the high septon and the ceremony beginning. In profile, her face had the quality of someone who had made their decision and arrived at it completely, without the reservations showing. Jon looked forward too. The ceremony moved through its forms, the 7 blessings, the exchange of vows before each aspect of the 7, father, mother, warrior, smith, maiden, crone, stranger. Jon spoke the words clearly, the way he had practiced, not performing them but meaning them in the specific way that words meant things when you understood the weight of saying them publicly and irrevocably in front of witnesses. The silent prayer came near the end. The couple faced the altar. The high septon withdrew for the traditional moment of private devotion before the cloak exchange, and the sept was quiet except for the breathing of 500 people and the candle flames moving in their sconces. Margaery spoke, very quietly, without looking at him. "You're not going to faint, are you?" He almost laughed. Did not, because the sept was very quiet and 500 people were very close. "I've been in battles. I know. This is different. In battles, people are trying to kill you. Here, everyone is watching you try to be something you've never been." He looked at the altar, at the colored light coming through the great window. "And what is that?" A pause. Brief. "Mine," she said. Another pause, shorter, and a king. "But mine first." He turned his head slightly and looked at her profile. She was still facing the altar, her expression composed, but something in the set of her jaw had changed, the slight easing of a person who has said the true thing and is waiting to find out what it costs. It cost nothing. That was the thing he wanted to tell her, that he was still working out how to say, that the arranged nature of what they were did not make her observation wrong, that he had spent 2 months watching her work and listening to her think and disagreeing with her in the evenings, and finding each time that her disagreements improved his position, and that he did not know yet whether what he felt was the beginning of something or simply the profound respect of a man who had finally met someone whose intelligence matched the scale of the problem they were both trying to solve. He thought he would tell her all of that later, when they were not in a sept. The high septon returned. The cloak exchange was the ceremony's center. Jon lifted the stark gray and dragon cloak from his shoulders and placed it around Margaery. It was large on her, made for his frame, settling across her Tyrell gold green like a layer of northern winter over southern summer, the black dragon at the hem resting against the rose-worked fabric of her dress. She received it without adjusting it, let it sit as it landed, and then she unclasped the Tyrell ceremonial cloak from her own shoulders and placed it around him. Gold green, the Reach. Roses at the border, he was wearing both. Suddenly, her colors and his, the northern gray and the southern gold-green layered one over the other in a way that was slightly impractical and entirely correct. She looked at him, he looked at her. They were, as she had said they would be, each other. The coronation followed the wedding with an interval of 20 minutes, enough time for the assembly to rearrange itself, for the high septon to change his robes, for the crown to be brought from the locked chest in the sept sacristy, where it had been placed the night before under Ned's personal watch. It was not a beautiful crown. Jon had seen it for the first time 3 days ago when Ned had shown it to him in the Tower of the Hand. Black iron and bronze, narrow, unadorned, the metalwork plain to the edge of severity, old-looking, deliberately so. The goldsmith had aged the metal at Jon's instruction, because everything this dynasty represented was older than the one it replaced. Ned had explained what it was made from. Iron and bronze worked into a simple circlet, the design drawn from descriptions of early Targaryen crowns before the dynasty had learned to be decorative. It did not announce itself. That was the point. It was a crown that said, "This dynasty is older than the one it replaces." It said it without announcing it. The lords would understand it the way people understood anything expressed through craft rather than words. Slowly, and then all at once. The High Septon raised it. The sept was absolutely still. Jon looked at Ned. Ned was already kneeling. He had moved before the High Septon lifted the crown, before any protocol required it, before the Tyrells or the Northern Lords or anyone else in the assembly. He had simply gone to his knee on the marble floor, while the crown was still being raised, in the specific way of a man who has been waiting 14 years to make this particular gesture, and has decided it requires no ceremony. The crown came down. The cold iron weight of it settled on Jon's head, heavier than he expected, heavier than it looked. He would think about that later, the specific weight of it, how it distributed itself unevenly at first and then seemed to settle, as if adjusting. The High Septon's voice filled the nave. The seven bear witness, the realm bears witness. Let all who have eyes and ears and standing in the seven kingdoms know that Aegon of House Targaryen, sixth of his name, true-born son of Rhaegar Targaryen, and Lyanna Stark, is crowned King of the Andals, the Rhoynar and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms, and Protector of the Realm. The assembly responded, not all at once and not with practiced unison, with the slightly ragged, entirely genuine sound of 500 people saying the same words without having rehearsed them together, which was its own kind of truth. Margaery stood at Jon's right. Jon sat on a ceremonial chair that was emphatically not the Iron Throne. That came later in the throne room, in front of the court, when the day had been fully transacted. For now he sat in the sept with the crown on his head, and Margaery beside him, and the colored light from the great window falling across the marble without preference or pattern. He looked at the assembly, at the bent heads, and the upturned faces, and the lords calculating, and the common people in the back rows who had been admitted by lottery, and were looking at him with an expression that had no politics in it. Just the simple, unfiltered attention of people who had come to see what a king looked like, and were making up their minds. He looked at Ned, still kneeling. "Get up," Jon said quietly. Ned rose. His face was the face Jon would carry. Jon looked at the window, at the colored light. Somewhere in the city, in a tower whose window faced the sept, Cersei Lannister was watching the smoke from the incense, and listening to the bells that had begun ringing from every sept and septling in King's Landing. Jon knew she was there, knew she was watching, knew the thing in her eyes was not fear, and not defeat, and not the end of anything she had decided to do. He filed it away for later. Later. There would be so much later now. Years of it, the long work of Jaehaerys the Conciliator rather than the brief fire of Aegon the Conqueror, the wall that needed constant repair and never stopped mattering. Margaery leaned very slightly toward him. Not visibly. A centimeter, the shift of a woman who was tired and would not show it and had decided that a centimeter was an acceptable indulgence. Jon did not move toward her. He simply did not move away. The bells rang. The letter from Pentos arrived on a Tuesday. Margaery read it twice at her writing desk before she called anyone in. The second reading was not because she had missed something in the first. It was the habit of a woman who had learned that important documents deserved the respect of being understood completely before being acted upon. Her grandmother had taught her that. Read it until you know what the writer wanted you to feel, then decide what you actually feel. Those are never the same thing. The letter was from a merchant factor in Pentos with a name she didn't recognize and a seal she did. A small pressed mark in the wax, a stylized H that belonged to a trading house with no official connection to anyone in this story. The trading house existed entirely for the purpose of receiving and transmitting messages that needed to arrive without fingerprints. The substance of the letter, stripped of its mercantile camouflage, was this. The Golden Company's captain had received 2 separate approaches in the past 3 weeks. The first was a set of ravens from Casterly Rock, routed through lice, carrying an offer of gold for 10,000 soldiers, terms of engagement to be negotiated, deployment requested within 60 days. The second was a personal visit from a Tyrell trading representative who had arrived in Pentos 18 days ago, presented a sealed letter of credit drawn on the Highgarden treasury, and offered 15% above whatever the Lannister ravens had offered, paid in full in advance, with a secondary payment upon completion of the non-engagement. The Golden Company had cashed the letter of credit. The Lannister ravens had gone unanswered. Margaery set the letter down, looked at the wall for a moment, then she wrote 3 letters of her own, one to her grandmother at Highgarden, one to Randil Tarley at the Rose Road position, one to Ned in the Tower of the Hand, and sent them before the ink was dry on any of them. The letter to her grandmother contained 2 words beyond the formal salutation. It worked. Ned received his letter at the morning council. He read it at the table without expression, folded it, and placed it in his sleeve. Across from him, Littlefinger watched this with the eyes of a man who had noticed that the hand had received something and had decided that what the hand received was his business. "Good news?" Littlefinger asked. The warmth in his voice was the warmth of a fire that someone else was tending, comfortable to stand near as long as you remembered you hadn't built it. "Trade correspondence," Ned said. "Of course." Littlefinger looked at his own papers. "I've been reviewing the Crown's outstanding debt obligations, my lord. There are several arrangements with Lannister-affiliated creditors that will require renegotiation in light of the current situation. I wondered if I might have an hour of your time this week to discuss the approach." "Thursday." Littlefinger smiled. "I'll bring the full picture." That was the thing about Littlefinger. He was genuinely useful, which made him genuinely dangerous, which made every useful thing he did a problem that had to be assessed before it could be accepted. Ned had been doing this assessment every day for 2 months, and had not yet found the bottom of it. He looked at the letter in his sleeve, thought about 10,000 Golden Company soldiers who were not marching to Casterly Rock. He thought about Tywin Lannister in his impregnable fortress, receiving no answer from Pentos, understanding what the silence meant. He thought about what a man like Tywin did when the thing he reached for wasn't there. Casterly Rock was, as everyone who had ever looked at it from the outside acknowledged, not a castle so much as a mountain that had been given opinions. It sat above the western sea on a promontory of solid rock that had been occupied, fortified, tunneled through, built upon, and expanded for 8,000 years. The Lannisters had not built it. They had taken it from the Casterlys in the Age of Heroes, and had spent every generation since making it more completely theirs. The gold mines ran through its roots. The great harbor at its base controlled the western shipping lanes. The walls were not walls so much as extensions of the cliff face, the stone of the mountain and the stone of the fortification becoming indistinguishable at the joins. Randyll Tarly looked at it for a long time from the siege line's forward position. "We cannot take it," he said. He said it with the specific flatness of a man stating a fact that required no emotional coloring. "Not in any time frame that matters. Not in any time frame that doesn't matter. That rock has never fallen to direct assault, and it will not fall to ours." Jon stood beside him. The sea wind came off the water hard and cold, carrying salt and the smell of the Lannister harbor below. Ships at anchor, the fishing boats that the siege had not troubled because troubling fishing boats was the kind of thing that made common people hate you, and common people were not the enemy. "We don't need to take it," Jon said. "No, we need them to open the gates." Tarly looked at the rock. "Those are different problems. The siege lines had been established for 3 weeks, not assault lines. Containment lines, the difference being that assault lines existed to advance, and containment lines existed to prevent. No Lannister supply caravan had reached the rock in 22 days. The Red Wine Fleet controlled the harbor approaches. 200 warships anchored in the Western Sea, with the patient immobility of a force that had nowhere to be, and knew it. The rock's fishing harbor was open, because Jon had decided it would be open, because the fishermen were not soldiers and their boats were not weapons, and sealing the harbor would have cost him more in the perception of common people than it gained him in military pressure. Tarly had agreed with this decision without saying so, which was how Tarly expressed agreement. "His stores," Jon said. "He planned for 2 years. He is not a man who plans for less than the worst case." Tarly pulled his cloak against the wind, "Which means we are here for 2 years if we wait for him to run out of food. We're not waiting for him to run out of options," Jon said. "Those are different problems." Tarly was quiet for a moment. The sea wind, the rock against the sky, enormous and patient. The Golden Company. He reached for them and found nothing there. Jon looked at the rock. He reached for Renly and found Renly had decided that Storm's End was worth more than a failed gamble. He reached for the Vale through Lysa Arryn and found Lysa Arryn under Brynden Tully's regency, and Brynden Tully is not reachable by any lever Tywin has. He paused. He is a man who wins through options. He keeps more options than anyone else, and he deploys them faster and more intelligently than anyone else. We have spent 3 months removing his options, one at a time. What remains is the rock, his gold, his soldiers, and his mind. His mind is not negligible, no, but his mind requires something to work with. Jon turned from the rock. He'll negotiate. Tywin Lannister does not negotiate from inside a siege. He will when the alternative is watching his house end. Jon started back toward the command tent. He has one son left who can carry the name forward with any credibility. One son who is clever and politically capable, and personally connected to enough of the coalition that his elevation is not a provocation. He looked at Tarly over his shoulder. Tywin knows this. He's known it since the Sept. He's been calculating the cost of it ever since and waiting to find a number he can live with. Tarly walked with him. And have we found his number? Margaery found it. Jon said, 3 weeks ago when she outbid him for the Golden Company, that was the moment he understood that we could also think further ahead than the obvious move. He paused. He respects that, he doesn't like it. But he respects it. The raven from Casterly Rock arrived 4 days later. The terms came in Tywin Lannister's own hand, which was itself a statement, not a maester's transcription, not a secretary's draft, the old lion script, precise and without flourish, the handwriting of a man who considered ornamentation a form of weakness. Jon read them in the command tent with Margaery beside him and Tarly at the table's far end, and Ned's voice in the back of his mind, the voice from months of evenings in Winterfell's library. Read it until you know what the writer wanted you to feel. What Tywin wanted him to feel was the weight of the concession, the deliberate cost of each term, presented without apology or softening. I am doing this. I know what it costs. I am doing it anyway because I have calculated that it costs less than the alternative. That was the message beneath the terms, and Jon received it as it was sent. House Lannister retains Casterly Rock. The Westerlands remain Lannister territory. The mines continue operating. The terms of the Crown's debt to Lannister creditors to be renegotiated, but not repudiated. Tywin steps aside as Lord Paramount of the Westerlands. His successor, Tyrion Lannister, third child, youngest son, the one the family had spent 30 years treating as an embarrassment and a liability. Cersei and Jaime surrendered for the Crown's judgment. Jon set the letter down. He's giving us Tyrion, Margaery said. Not a criticism, an observation, the tone of someone filing a piece of information in the correct category. He thinks Tyrion is manageable. He thinks you'll find Tyrion useful, and that usefulness will protect the Lannister name. Tyrion is useful, Jon said. Yes, which means Tywin is correct, which means he gets what he wants, which is his house surviving with its seat and its gold and a son in a position of influence. She looked at the letter. He loses the political dominance. He accepts that. He's recalibrated what winning looks like. That's what we wanted, Jon said. It is. I'm simply noting that Tywin Lannister accepting our terms is not the same as Tywin Lannister being defeated. He will be Lord of Casterly Rock under a king he did not choose, in a Westerlands that owes fealty to a Targaryen dynasty he spent 17 years helping to extinguish, and he will find a way to make that serve him eventually. She paused. We should plan for that eventually. Jon thought about it, about the old man in the rock above the sea, writing his terms in his own hand, recalibrating what winning looked like, about the specific quality of an enemy who lost a battle and spent the night deciding what the loss was worth. Tyrion as Lord of Casterly Rock, Jon said. Yes, he'll come to court. Of course, he'll want to. He spent his entire life being kept away from the table. Now he has a seat. Margaery looked at Jon. The question is whether that seat is a problem or an asset. That depends on whether we treat him like his father treated him. She looked at him for a moment, which means not treating him like his father treated him. You're better at this than you think you are. Jon looked at the letter, at Tywin's handwriting, precise and without flourish. I'm reading Jaehaerys, the conciliator. He turned enemies into allies by giving them something real, Jon said. Not bribes, not false promises. Real things, real power, real positions, real acknowledgement. Tyrion Lannister as Lord of Casterly Rock is a real thing. His father knows it can't be taken back. That makes it a foundation. He paused. Foundations are harder to attack than promises. Margaery looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up the pen. I'll draft the response, she said. You sign it. You're better at the drafting. Yes, she agreed, without false modesty, already writing. And you're better at the signing. Between us we make one adequate king. He almost said something, decided the almost was enough. She wrote. He watched the sea wind move the tent wall. Outside, the siege lines held their positions in the last of the afternoon light, patient and cold, and above them the rock sat against the western sky, enormous and old and beginning, very slowly to open. They came down 3 days after the response was sent. Cersei first, which surprised no one who understood her. She would not allow Jaime to precede her, would not be seen following her brother out of a gate she had been forced to exit. She rode rather than walked, which was permitted, and she wore Lannister crimson rather than the plain prisoner's gray that protocol suggested, which was also permitted because Jon had decided the battles worth fighting were not this one. She looked at Jon from the saddle with those green eyes that had been calculating since the sept. He looked back at her with the patience he was still learning, the patience of a man who understood that some problems were not solved but managed, that some enemies were not defeated but survived, and that the difference between the two required constant attention to which category you were currently in. She said nothing. He said nothing. She rode past. Jaime came after her on foot, without armor, his golden hair flat in the sea wind, his face carrying the expression Jon had seen on it in the sept, the one that was afraid. He stopped in front of Jon and looked at him with eyes that were searching for something and not finding it, or finding it in the wrong place. "The Night's Watch," Jaime said. His voice was flat, accepting something. "Castle Black," Jon said. "They need good swords. I'm the Kingslayer. They don't want me. The Watch takes men who need to become something else. That's what it's for." Jon held his gaze. "You saved King's Landing from the wildfire. You killed Aerys before he could burn the city. You have never told anyone that because you decided their contempt was easier to carry than the explanation." He paused. "Tell the Watch. Tell them the truth of it earned the Black honestly." Something moved in his face. Not gratitude, not yet, not from a man who would need years to learn the shape of it, but something adjacent to recognition. He walked through the gate. The Rock's gates closed behind him. Tarly came to stand beside Jon as the Lannister party moved down the coastal road toward the escort that would take them north. "Not what I expected," Tarly said. "Which part? Any of it?" He watched Cersei's crimson cloak diminish down the road. "You gave them terms. Yes, generous ones. Survivable ones," Jon said. "There's a difference." Tarly was quiet. The sea wind came hard off the water. Somewhere in the harbor below, the red wine fleet was beginning to stand down, the long, patient vigil ending in the particular way that vigils ended. Not dramatically, but with the gradual relaxation of held breath. "Jaehaerys," Tarly said. Jon looked at him. "I read the chapter," Tarly said. "After you mentioned it." He paused with the specific quality of a man admitting something he had not planned to admit. He was right about foundations. Jon looked at the Rock, at the gates closed behind Jaime Lannister, at the walls that had stood for 8,000 years and would stand for 8,000 more. Lannister walls under a Targaryen crown, the uneasy, complicated arrangement of a realm that had been put back together rather than burned down. "We're not finished," Jon said. "No," Tarly agreed, "but we're further along than we were." It was, Jon had learned how Randyll Tarly expressed optimism. He took it. The Great Council took 3 weeks to assemble. Lords came from every corner of the realm, some quickly, some slowly, the speed of their arrival corresponding roughly to how certain they were about the calculation. The ones who had knelt in the sept arrived first. The ones who had been watching from a careful distance arrived in the second week, studying the faces of the men ahead of them in the queue for information about what kneeling had cost. The Freys arrived in the third week with a price already prepared, which was expected, and a price lower than anticipated, which was what happened when the alternative was clear enough. Jon received them in the throne room. The Iron Throne was exactly what everyone said it was, a miserable piece of furniture, made from 1,000 swords melted and beaten into a shape that suggested authority through discomfort, as if the original maker had decided that a king who sat easily was a king who wasn't thinking hard enough. Jon had cut his hand on it the first time he sat in it, a shallow cut along the right palm from a blade edge that protruded at the armrest's join. He had wrapped it himself, without ceremony, and gone back to the business of the day. He had not told anyone. Margaery had noticed the wrapping and not asked, which meant she already knew and had decided it was his business. He filed this away as another example of a quality he was still learning to name in her, the specific intelligence of knowing which silences were gifts. The Lord swore, one by one, house by house, the formulaic words of fealty that had been spoken in this room to a dozen kings before him and would be spoken to a dozen kings after him, the words meaning exactly as much as the man saying them intended them to mean, and not one word more. Jon received each oath with the correct gravity and the correct acknowledgement and the carefully measured warmth that Margaery had helped him calibrate over 3 weeks of evenings, that had started as political preparation and had become something else. Something he didn't have a name for yet but was no longer pretending wasn't happening. The holdouts were managed one at a time. The Vale was simplest. Brynden Tully, as Robin Arryn's regent, was a man whose honor was his most prominent feature and whose reading of the situation had been clear since the Sept. He swore for the Vale without conditions, which meant the mountain passes were open and the eastern supply corridor was secure. Balon Greyjoy sent no one. The Raven from Pike arrived on the council's second day, written in the Iron Islands' particular style, which was to say bluntly, and said that the Iron Islands acknowledged the new king's authority over the mainland kingdoms and reserved all traditional rights of the Ironborn under their own customs, and would neither swear nor rebel at this time. Jon read the Raven, read it again, and then looked at Ned. "He's telling us he exists," Ned said. "Yes, about Balon Greyjoy on his salt throne, watching the mainland rearrange itself, calculating whether the new king was the kind of problem that required direct engagement or the kind that could be managed through strategic indifference." He thought about Theon, who was at Winterfell, who had been at Winterfell since Ned rode south, who had spent months in a castle that was half empty and entirely changed. "Leave it," Jon said. "For now, he's not moving and we're not ready to make the islands a priority." He set the Raven down. "When we're ready, we'll go to him rather than summoning him. Men like Balon Greyjoy don't come to courts. You go to them on their water and you speak to them in their language." Ned looked at him with the expression Jon had learned to recognize as Ned arriving at the same conclusion, by a different route, and finding them parallel. "Your grandfather Rickard was trying to do something similar when Aerys killed him. I know. I read about it." Jon looked at the Raven. "I intend to do it better." Tyrion arrived on the council's third week. He came without ceremony, which was itself a kind of ceremony. The deliberate absence of display from a man who understood that display would read as overcompensation and had decided that arriving quietly was its own statement. He was smaller than Jon had expected and sharper than Jon had prepared for, the mismatched eyes taking in the throne room in a single practice sweep that missed nothing and filed everything. He stopped in front of the throne, looked at Jon. "Your Grace," he said. The title sat slightly oddly in his mouth, not from disrespect, but from the adjustment of a man saying a new thing for the first time and checking how it sounded. "Lord of Casterly Rock, presenting himself to swear fealty." A pause. "My father's terms, his terms and mine," Jon said. "There's a difference. You read the conciliator." "I did." 55 years, Tyrion said. "Longest reign in Targaryen history, built more than he burned, which puts him in rare company." He tilted his head. Jaehaerys had Alysanne. Jon looked at Margaery, who was standing to his right at the position she occupied for formal audiences, near enough to be visible, positioned to observe the full room. She was watching Tyrion with the focused attention of someone deciding how much of their hand to show. "I'm aware of the parallel," Jon said. Tyrion's eyes moved to Margaery. She looked back at him with the court expression, the one that gave nothing. He seemed to find this satisfying, the expression of someone who had checked a fact and found it accurate. He knelt, said the words, rose. "My Lord of Casterly Rock," Jon said, "I'd like your counsel when you have time." "Not immediately. Settle yourself first, find your footing in the city." The thing in his face was not quite suspicion and not quite hope, the expression of a man who had been offered real things so rarely that he had developed a reflex for checking whether the offered thing was actually real before allowing himself to want it. "Counsel," Tyrion said. "On the Iron Bank, on the Crown's debt structure, on the Westerland's economic relationship with the Reach supply chains." Jon paused. "You understand how money moves through this kingdom better than anyone currently on the small council." "Better than Littlefinger?" "Littlefinger understands how to use money as a lever. That's different from understanding how money moves." Jon held his gaze. "I need someone who can tell me the difference between a debt that can be renegotiated and a debt that will collapse the system if touched. Those are not the same thing, and they don't look the same from where I sit." Then, Thursday, Jon agreed. Tyrion walked away from the throne toward the side exit, stopped, half-turned. "The hand?" "Lord Stark." He said it carefully, the way someone says a thing they have been thinking about for a while. He refused this position once, 17 years ago, more or less. It nearly destroyed everything. He looked at Jon. He took it this time, and it built everything instead. That's not nothing. That's worth noting. He left. Jon looked at the empty doorway for a moment. "He'll be useful," Margaery said. "Quiet for him only." "Yes. He'll also be complicated. Everything useful is complicated." She made a small sound that was almost a laugh. He was collecting those, the real responses, the ones that escaped before the court expression could catch them. Ned came to Jon the evening before his departure. Not to the throne room, to the smaller solar that Jon had claimed as his own working space, the room that faced north, which was not an accident. The window looked toward the neck and the hills above it, and the gray-white sky that promised winter in the specific way of northern skies even from this distance. Jon was at the desk, not reading for once, just sitting. Ned closed the door, sat across from him in the plain chair that Jon had put there for exactly this kind of conversation. No ceremony, no position, just two people in a room with the door closed. "Tomorrow," Jon said. "Early, before the city wakes. You don't want a ceremony. I don't need one." Ned looked at him steadily. "You don't need me here anymore. That's not a criticism. It's the point. The thing I came to do is done." Jon looked at the desk, at the papers on it, reports, correspondence, the ongoing management of a realm that generated problems faster than any one person could solve them, which was exactly what J. Harris had described in the chapter Jon had read 6 times now. A kingdom is not a thing you finish. It is a thing you tend. The king who thinks he has finished is the king who has stopped paying attention. "The wall," Jon said. "Yes. You're not going to rest." "I never have." Ned said it without complaint. "Brynden Tully has the Vale in hand. Robb has Winterfell. The north is as secure as the north gets." He paused. "But the wall is old and the watch is small and the thing beyond it does not care about the Iron Throne or who sits it." "I know. I've been corresponding with Maester Aemon. He's 90 years old and sharper than men half his age, and he has been saying the same thing for 30 years without anyone listening." Ned's voice had the particular quality of a man who had decided to say something difficult simply. "They're coming, Jon. You know it. I know it. The question is whether the realm is ready when they arrive, and the answer currently is no, not even close." Jon looked at the window, at the northern sky. "I've been thinking about Dragonglass," Jon said. Ned looked at him. "Dragonstone sits empty. It has for 17 years. The island has natural deposits of obsidian in the caves along the eastern shore." Jon had read this in the Targaryen histories, in a footnote that no one had bothered to consider militarily, because no one had needed to. If the others are coming, we need weapons that work against them. Dragonglass works against them. It's been recorded by the Night's Watch in their oldest texts, even if most men have stopped believing those texts mean anything. He paused. "I need you to take that knowledge to the wall, to Aemon, to whoever at Castle Black will listen. All of them will listen if the hand of the king tells them to. You're not the hand anymore. No. But I am Ned Stark, and in the north that means something that titles don't always mean." He stood. "I'll go to Dragonstone before I go north. Take what I can carry, bring enough to show them what it is and what it does." He looked at Jon. "And I'll send ravens when we find signs of movement beyond the wall. You'll know what I know when I know it." Jon stood. They stood across the desk from each other, the papers between them, the northern window behind Jon's shoulder with its gray-white sky. He wanted to say something adequate to the situation, something that measured what Ned had done. The 14 years of silence, the decision in the tower, the ride south, the sept, all of it, and reflected it back with sufficient weight. He had been trying to find those words for months and had not found them. He thought perhaps they didn't exist. Perhaps that was the point. "You taught me everything I needed," Jon said. Ned looked at him. The expression, the one he would carry, was there again, complete and quiet and full of the specific grief that lived alongside the specific satisfaction of a thing properly finished. "You learned it," Ned said. "That's different. Don't give me credit for your understanding." He walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the latch. "Margaery," he said. "Not a question. Yes. Good." He didn't elaborate. Ned had never been a man who elaborated when a single word covered the ground. He opened the door, paused one final time. "Send me ravens, boy." Jon almost smiled. "My lord hand." "I'm not—" Ned stopped, looked at Jon with that expression. "I'm just Ned Stark. I always was." He left. Jon sat at the desk for a long time after the door closed. The city outside was settling into evening, the noise of it changing registers, the daytime commerce fading, the nighttime beginning. 40,000 people moving through the transition without awareness that they were doing it. He listened to it the way he had listened to Winterfell settle at night when he was a boy. The sounds of a living thing breathing. Margaery came in without knocking, which had become her habit and which he had decided he didn't mind. She sat in the plain chair across from him and looked at his face and did not ask what had been said, because she could read what had been said in his expression, and asking would have been redundant. She had a letter in her hand. "Daenerys Targaryen," she said. Jon looked at her. "A raven routed through 6 intermediaries to a factor in Braavos to our trading house there, which means someone in Essos has gone to considerable trouble to ensure this message arrives without fingerprints." She set the letter on the desk. "She has dragons." Jon was still. 3 of them, hatched from eggs at her husband's funeral pyre. Margaery's voice was careful, the voice she used when she was presenting information that required accurate reception. "She is somewhere in the Dothraki Sea. The routing delay through 6 intermediaries means this news is weeks old. The hatching itself happened some time ago, while we were still managing the siege." A pause. "She has no fleet, no army, no Westerosi backing." Another pause. "And 3 living dragons, which is the first time that sentence has been true in 150 years. Jon looked at the letter, did not pick it up. His aunt, his father's younger sister whom he had never met, who had survived things that should not have been survivable, who had emerged from a funeral pyre with 3 dragons in her arms and a claim to the Iron Throne that was, by strict Targaryen succession, senior to his own. He thought about what Margaery had said months ago, when Daenerys was still a distant figure with no dragons and no immediate relevance. She is not a factor at this point. The qualifier, the careful, precise qualifier. She was a factor now. Had been one, it turned out, for weeks. The news had simply been traveling. "She'll come west eventually," Jon said. "Yes. When she's ready, when she has enough, she'll come." Margaery looked at him steadily. "The question is whether she comes as a conqueror or as family." At the gray-white sky that was fully dark now, the first stars coming through the cloud cover above the neck, and the hills and the wall beyond them, the ancient structure that was the realm's real border, the one that mattered most. He thought about the wall, about Ned riding north tomorrow with dragon glass in his saddlebags and ravens to send when the signs came, about the men at Castle Black who were mostly criminals and outcasts, and the discarded men of noble houses and who were, for all of that, the only thing standing between the realm and what lived in the cold. He thought about dragons, about what dragons meant for things that rose from the dead and moved in darkness and could not be killed by ordinary steel. "Write to her," Jon said. Margaery looked at him, not through Illyrio, through someone we control entirely. "A personal letter from me to her." He looked at the letter on the desk. "She is my father's sister. She has lost as much as I have. She has been told all her life that she was the last, that the Targaryen line ended with her, and now she finds out there is a nephew she didn't know about sitting the throne she believed was hers." He paused. "She deserves to hear from me before she decides what to do with that information. What will you say?" Jon thought about it, about the right words for a woman he had never met, who had survived things he hadn't, who had dragons and a grief he could only imagine, and a claim that was real and complicated and would need to be resolved with honesty rather than politics. "The truth," he said, "all of it, Lyanna, Rhaegar, the Tower, what I am and how I came to be here." He looked at Margaery, "and that the realm needs what she has, not her throne, what she has." He touched the letter briefly. "The wall needs dragons. The thing beyond the wall dies in fire. She should know that. She should know why it matters." Margaery was quiet for a moment, then she picked up a pen and pulled a clean sheet of parchment from the desk's side drawer and held them both out to him. "Write it yourself," she said. "Don't have a maester draft it. She'll know the difference." He took the pen. Outside, King's Landing breathed in the dark. The ships on the Blackwater showed their lights. The chalk dragons on the alley walls were invisible now, waiting for morning to make them visible again. Somewhere to the north, beyond the neck, beyond the hills, beyond the ancient ice of the wall and the vast dark forest beyond it, something old and cold and patient waited with the same patience it had been practicing for 8,000 years. It would not wait forever. But tonight the fire was lit, the letters were being written, the foundations were being laid, imperfectly, incompletely, in the way that all foundations were laid by people who could see only as far as the next problem and trusted that the work was worth doing anyway. Jon wrote. The candle burned. The snow began to fall outside the northern window, the first snow of the season, soft and very quiet, settling on the rooftops of King's Landing like something making a point. He kept writing. "Let us know what you'd like to see next." The end.